London in the 19th century was a wonder of the world. It was the beating heart of the British Empire, a hub of trade, fashion, science, and culture. From the outside, it looked like a marvel of progress. Steamships brought goods from every corner of the globe, railways stitched the countryside to the capital, and factories churned out everything from textiles to toys. This was the glittering jewel of industrial power. But there was a catch. The jewel smelled like it had been dunked in a cesspit. The good news? The city was alive with industry. The bad news? It smelled like the industry hadn't bathed in months. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Anyone arriving in London for the first time would be struck not only by the crowds, the noise and the sheer immensity of the place, but also by the smell that seemed to hang in the air like an unwelcome fog. Imagine walking off a boat at the docks and being hit with a bouquet of odors: coal smoke, stale beer, horse manure, human sweat, fish guts, and the faint promise of something dead just out of sight. Congratulations, welcome to Victorian London, a city that could knock you over with its resume and its aroma. To understand the scale of the stink, you need to imagine the city as a living organism. London was like a giant body with a serious hygiene problem. Its arteries were the crowded streets, its lungs the coal-stained air, and its digestive system, well, let's just say it was constantly having an accident. Unlike the cities of antiquity, which often had smaller populations and slower growth, Victorian London expanded at breakneck speed. The population exploded from around 1 million in 1800 to over 6 million by the century's end. That meant more houses, more factories, more animals, more people, and most importantly, more things producing smells. And while today's cities deal with odors by whisking waste into hidden sewer systems and sending garbage off in trucks, Victorian London didn't have those luxuries at first. Instead, the smells lingered, built up and mingled until the whole city seemed to perfume itself in what one observer politely described as a rich variety of effluvia. Less politely, it was a smorgasbord of stink. One of the most striking things about Victorian London's smellscape was how democratic it was. Unlike money, social class or fancy titles, the stench did not discriminate. It wafted across neighborhoods, curling into alleys, drifting over mansions, and slipping under doors. Even members of Parliament could not escape it. The city's air was an equal opportunity offender, managing to unite Londoners in one way, by making everyone wrinkle their noses. But smell in Victorian London wasn't just a matter of discomfort, it was a matter of identity. Writers, travelers, and journalists of the time often defined the city by its odors. Guidebooks and travel diaries described not only the monuments and theatres, but also the characteristic aroma that seemed to cling to the streets. The stench became a shorthand for London itself, as familiar as the chiming of Big Ben, or the sight of hansom cabs rattling through the fog. Of course, people back then didn't necessarily think of smells in the same way we do today. Our modern obsession with deodorants, scented candles, and air fresheners hadn't yet arrived. In an age before germ theory was fully understood, bad smells were not just unpleasant, they were terrifying. The prevailing belief was the miasma theory, the idea that diseases like cholera and typhoid were spread by foul air. So every whiff of sewage or rotting food wasn't just gross, it felt like a death sentence wrapped in a bad perfume. Imagine walking past a reeking alleyway and thinking, that smell could literally kill me. Suddenly, even a scented handkerchief didn't feel like enough protection. But despite their fears, Londoners lived with these odors daily, developing what might be called smell tolerance. After all, when your morning walk to work takes you past tanneries, horse stables, crowded markets and pubs that doubled as urinals, your nose eventually surrenders. Visitors, however, were not so lucky. Foreign dignitaries often wrote horrified descriptions of the city's atmosphere, as if they had wandered into some olfactory battlefield. For them, the smell was unforgettable, like London had given them a souvenir that followed them home. clinging stubbornly to their clothes. The irony of it all is that London was simultaneously advancing into the modern age while still smelling medieval. You could take a train to Brighton, send a telegram across the Atlantic, or admire the engineering marvel of the Crystal Palace, all while standing in a street that reeked like a clogged drain. It was a place where science and stench coexisted in a bizarre partnership, as though progress had sprinted ahead while sanitation lagged behind, tripping over its own chamber pot. But here's the most remarkable part. Despite the overwhelming smell, life went on. People shopped, worked, courted, and raised families in a city where fresh air was often more of a rumor than a reality. London was proof of humanity's astonishing ability to adapt, even if it meant adapting to a city that sometimes smelled like an entire fish market had exploded into a chimney. So when we talk about the greatness of Victorian London, the wealth, the innovation, the sheer scale of its influence, we must also talk about the odor, because the story of this city is not just one of progress, it's also one of smell. London may have dazzled the eyes, but it assaulted the nose, and that is where our journey begins, in a city of stench, where survival meant not just enduring the crowds, but surviving the smellscape of the greatest city in the world. If you think your commute is crowded, spare a thought for Victorian London. By the middle of the 19th century, the city had transformed into the human equivalent of a can of sardines, without the benefit of being neatly packed or smelling remotely of the sea. This was a metropolis groaning under the sheer weight of people, and the result was an urban stew of noise, chaos, and inevitably smell. London didn't just grow in the Victorian era, it ballooned like a loaf of bread left too close to the fire. At the dawn of the 1800s, the city was already impressive with a population of around 1 million. But by 1850 it had surged past 2 million, and by the end of the century over 6 million people were crammed into the capital. That made London the largest city in the world, an impressive title though less glamorous when you realize it was also the world's largest queue for a decent breath of fresh air. The cause of this boom was a cocktail of factors: industrialization, empire, and the promise of work. Factories and workshops were magnets for labourers, drawing in people from the British countryside as well as from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Add to this the influx of immigrants from continental Europe, and you had a city growing at a speed that made urban planners wake up sweating into their chamber pots. London wasn't ready for the sheer human tide pouring into it. The biggest problem? Housing. For every elegant row of townhouses in the West End, there were 10 crumbling tenements in the East. These weren't just crowded, they were sardine tins stacked on top of sardine tins. Families of 6, 8, or even 12 might squeeze into a single room, often sharing that space with lodgers to cover rent. Privacy was a luxury, and personal space was about as real as unicorns. More people meant more smells. Imagine cramming the world's largest armpit into a corset that was London, and the crush of people didn't just fill up homes, it overflowed into the streets. Markets were jammed shoulder to shoulder, alleys echoed with footsteps at all hours, and public spaces became seas of hats, skirts, and boots. Walking down a busy thoroughfare like Oxford Street or Cheapside could feel like wading into a human tide, with the added bonus that everyone had forgotten to shower. There were no personal bubbles, no 6 feet of distance, just a constant press of bodies, elbows, and the occasional pickpocket. This density created a unique urban soundtrack: the rumble of carts, the clop of horses, the shouting of hawkers, and the cries of street children, all blended into one chaotic chorus. Layer on top the coughing of factory workers, the bawling of babies, and the occasional fight breaking out outside a gin shop. And you had a city that never gave your ears or your nose a rest. But the real issue with so many people wasn't just noise, it was logistics. Every single one of those millions of Londoners needed water, food, shelter, and some way to get rid of their waste. The city's infrastructure simply wasn't built for it. Narrow medieval streets had to handle traffic from an age of carriages and omnibuses. Wells and pumps struggled to provide enough water, and when they did, it wasn't always clean. And as for waste disposal, Well, let's just say that 6 million people produce a lot of it, and the city wasn't exactly in a rush to find somewhere sanitary to put it. The overcrowding also meant disease spread like gossip at a tea party. One person got sick and suddenly the whole tenement was coughing. Tuberculosis, typhus and measles found London an ideal playground. Life expectancy in some poorer districts dipped shockingly low, sometimes averaging under 30 years. To put that in perspective, many Victorians didn't have midlife crises. They didn't even make it to midlife. Meanwhile, the wealthier classes often looked at this human flood with a mix of horror and inconvenience. For the aristocrats in their mansions, the influx of labourers was useful for staffing their kitchens and scrubbing their floors, but heaven forbid they live near them. The city became a patchwork quilt of extreme wealth and desperate poverty, stitched together by streets that funneled everyone, rich or poor, into the same smelly air. As London swelled, so did the sense of urgency. Reformers, journalists and social critics wrote despairingly about the state of the city. Charles Dickens, for example, didn't have to invent misery for his novels. He simply had to walk outside. Observers worried that this uncontrolled growth would turn the capital of the empire into a festering slum, a giant monument to humanity's inability to share space politely. Yet despite all this, people kept coming, because for all the overcrowding, disease and filth, London was still where fortunes could be made, where work could be found, and where opportunity buzzed as loudly as the flies hovering over the markets. The city was like a fire. It burned, it consumed, it suffocated, but it also drew people in with its warmth and promise. By the end of the 19th century, London's population had reached heights unimaginable a century before, and its skyline bristled with the symbols of empire and industry. But beneath the domes and spires, in the alleys and tenements, the reality was far less glamorous. Overcrowding had changed not just how people lived, but how they smelled, how they worked, and how they saw themselves in a city bursting at the seams. London was the heart of the world, but it was also the armpit. And like any overstuffed body, it was starting to sweat. If you've ever skipped a shower and felt guilty about it, congratulations, you're already more hygienic than most Victorians. Bathing in the 19th century wasn't a daily activity. It was an event, almost like a royal coronation, except with less ceremony and a lot more grime. For many people, the question wasn't how often should I bathe, but why would I bathe at all? Bathing was optional like dessert. Sadly, dessert didn't make you stink less. To understand why Victorians lived this way, you need to remember two things: plumbing and beliefs. Running water wasn't standard in most homes, and even when it was available, it wasn't always safe to drink, let alone safe to immerse yourself in. Water often came from pumps, wells, or directly from the river, which is to say it came with a bonus package of bacteria and mystery floating bits. So hauling buckets of this dubious liquid, heating it over a fire and dumping it into a tub wasn't exactly a convenient Saturday morning ritual. For the average working-class Londoner, bathing at home was about as practical as flying to the moon. And then there were the beliefs. Many Victorians subscribed to the idea that too much bathing was unhealthy. Exposing the body to water, especially cold water, was thought to invite illness. Some even believed that washing away the natural oils and grime of the skin weakened the body. In other words, dirt wasn't filth. It was a protective layer like a grimy superhero cape. Unfortunately, it didn't protect your neighbours' noses. So how did people clean themselves? For most, the answer was spot washing. Instead of a full bath, you might scrub your face, hands, and maybe, if you were feeling especially bold, your feet. Think of it as the Victorian version of hitting the skip intro button on Hygiene. Full immersion in a bath was rare, sometimes only happening a few times a year, unless you were rich enough to afford the luxury of indoor plumbing or a trip to a public bathhouse. The wealthy, of course, could indulge more often. They had bathrooms installed in their grand houses, complete with large tubs and heated water. But even then, the frequency of bathing was nothing like today. A wealthy Victorian might bathe once a week, lavish by the standards of their poorer neighbours, but still a far cry from our daily showers. Perfume, powders, and scented oils were popular not just because they smelled nice, but because they masked the fact that everyone smelled human, very human. Clothing added another dimension to the problem. Laundry was an ordeal without washing machines. Cleaning clothes meant scrubbing them by hand, boiling them in large vats, and wringing them out until your arms felt like jelly. Naturally, people avoided doing it often. Undergarments were meant to be changed more regularly, but outer garments, jackets, trousers, dresses could go weeks or months without seeing soap. That meant clothes absorbed the sweat, smoke, and street smells of daily life, until they developed what might politely be called character. Hair care was equally hit or miss. Shampoo wasn't widely available, and hair was often washed with soap or not at all. Women especially were encouraged to brush their hair regularly to distribute oils, which sounds elegant until you realize it essentially meant spreading grease evenly across the scalp. Men, meanwhile, coated their hair with pomades or oils, ensuring that even if they didn't smell fresh, at least their hair had the texture of a waxed floor. Teeth didn't fare much better. Toothbrushes did exist, but toothpaste was still developing as a concept. Some people used powders made of chalk, charcoal, or even crushed brick. These dentifrices were about as gentle as sandpaper and often did more harm than good. Dental hygiene was less about a sparkling smile and more about hoping you didn't lose all your teeth before you hit 40. Spoiler, many did. Body odor, meanwhile, was simply a fact of life. Deodorants, as we know them, didn't exist until the very late 19th century. And even then they were rare and expensive. Instead, people relied on colognes, perfumes, and powders to cover the smell. The problem was that these strong scents mixed with sweat and grime, creating a cocktail that was less elegant fragrance and more floral swamp. Imagine lavender valiantly battling body odor and losing every single time. For the working classes, the situation was worse. Crowded housing and long hours of labor meant less opportunity for even minimal washing. Sweat from factory floors, soot from chimneys, and grime from the streets clung to skin and clothing alike. It wasn't unusual for families to share a single basin of water, everyone taking turns with the same murky liquid. If you were unlucky enough to go last, you might actually come out dirtier than when you started. The sheer lack of hygiene created cultural stereotypes. Foreign visitors often mocked the English as the great unwashed, a phrase that stuck. And while Londoners might not have appreciated the insult, they couldn't exactly argue against it either. When an entire city smells like a combination of coal smoke and body odor, you don't need a scientific study to know something's off. Yet, despite all of this, there was an undeniable resilience. People still went about their lives, courting, working, dining, surrounded by smells we would find unbearable today. In fact, many Victorians didn't even notice anymore. Their noses had adjusted to the permanent background funk. What would send a modern tourist reeling was for them just another Tuesday. So while we might shake our heads at their habits, it's worth remembering that the great unwashed weren't lazy or careless. They were living in a world where water was hard to come by, beliefs discouraged too much bathing, and the technology we take for granted simply didn't exist. Their version of normal just happened to involve a little more dirt, sweat, and odor than ours. Still, next time you step out of a hot shower feeling clean, just take a moment to whisper, "Thank you, plumbing." Let's talk about the part of life that everyone does but no one really wants to discuss: going to the toilet. In Victorian London, this daily necessity was less about privacy and convenience, and more about improvisation and sheer tolerance. Forget modern bathrooms with flushing toilets and scented air fresheners. The Victorians had chamber pots, cesspits, and night soil men. The result? The city may have been the capital of an empire, but when it came to waste disposal, it was more like the capital of creative suffering. If your neighbour wasn't talking rubbish, they were literally throwing it out the window. For most Londoners, the chamber pot was the throne of choice. These humble vessels sat discreetly under beds or in corners, ready to receive whatever nature decided to produce. In theory, they offered a practical solution to the lack of indoor plumbing. In practice, they were ticking odor bombs that had to be emptied somewhere. And here's the kicker: somewhere often meant straight into the street. Picture this: residents leaning out of upper windows, casually dumping their pots into the alley below and hoping no one happened to be passing by. If you think dodging pigeons today is bad, try dodging a sudden downpour of human waste. For those who didn't fancy this aerial bombardment, there were cesspits, underground storage chambers dug beneath houses or courtyards. At first glance they seemed like an improvement, at least the waste went somewhere hidden, but cesspits had an annoying habit of filling up, overflowing, or leaking into the surrounding soil. Imagine living in a basement flat and realizing your floorboards had started to sweat, and not from condensation. The smell alone could transform even the most elegant townhouse into an uninhabitable nightmare. And so, out of necessity, a profession was born: the night soil man. These were the unsung and unwashed heroes of Victorian sanitation. Under cover of darkness, they crept through the city, shoveling, scooping, and hauling away the contents of cesspits and privies. It was grueling, foul work, but someone had to do it. Night soil men were both essential and despised. People wanted their waste gone, but preferred not to think about the men who carried it away. Pay was decent, but the social stigma was enormous. After all, no one wanted to sit next to the guy whose job was literally professional poo remover. What happened to all this collected waste? Ideally, it was carted away to be dumped in fields outside the city, where it was used as fertilizer. Less ideally, it ended up in rivers, ditches, or anywhere else it could be disposed of quickly. The sheer volume of waste was staggering. With millions of people producing daily deposits, London created an avalanche of filth that its infrastructure simply couldn't keep up with. If gold were measured by weight, the Victorians would have been billionaires in excrement. Public privies did exist, though they were far from plentiful. Early versions were rudimentary at best, wooden seats over pits that quickly filled and reeked. Many were reserved for men, leaving women with fewer options, hence the chamber pot's enduring popularity. Even when more public toilets began to appear later in the century, they often came with a fee. For a penny, you could buy a moment's relief, giving rise to the phrase "to spend a penny." It was a polite euphemism for what was, in reality, a grimy and often smelly experience. The lack of proper disposal had consequences beyond the obvious. Streets and alleys sometimes doubled as open latrines, particularly in poorer districts where people couldn't afford alternatives. This added yet another layer to London's already complex odor palette. Visitors wrote horrified accounts of the city's casual relationship with excrement, marveling at how one could turn a corner and be greeted by an unexpected puddle of humanity's least charming byproduct. For residents, it was simply part of daily navigation, like avoiding potholes, but worse. Children often played in streets where chamber pot contents had recently been tossed, blissfully unaware of the dangers. It's hard not to wince imagining little boys kicking a ball straight into a puddle of what we might politely call liquid history. But this was the reality of a city that had outgrown its medieval infrastructure without yet inventing modern solutions. The stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was feared. The miasma theory, which held that foul smells caused disease, made the presence of human waste in the streets doubly terrifying. Every whiff was seen as a potential killer. People stuffed their noses with handkerchiefs, sprinkled vinegar on sponges, or carried posies of flowers to ward off the stench. But no amount of lavender could disguise the reality that London was drowning in its own waste. Of course, the Victorians weren't entirely oblivious. Reformers, doctors, and social critics called attention to the dire state of sanitation. Reports were written, committees formed, and politicians wrung their hands over the problem. But until Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system began transforming the city in the late 19th century, chamber pots and night soil men remained the backbone of London's waste management. So next time you flush a toilet and forget about it instantly, spare a thought for the Victorians. Their bathroom experience involved balancing a pot under the bed, hiring a man with a shovel, and praying that their neighbour didn't lean out the window at the wrong moment. London may have been the heart of an empire, but it was also quite literally a city constantly knee-deep in its own business. If you think a puddle of rainwater on the sidewalk is inconvenient, Imagine that puddle being brown, bubbling, and suspiciously warm. Welcome to the reality of Victorian London, where the streets didn't run with gold, they ran with yesterday's dinner. For centuries, London relied on cesspits, brick-lined holes beneath homes, yards or courtyards intended to catch and hold human waste. On paper, this seemed civilized compared to tossing chamber pots directly into the street. In practice, it was about as effective as using a tea strainer to hold back a flood. With the city's population exploding, these pits filled faster than anyone could manage. When they overflowed, the contents seeped through walls, rose through floors, or burst outright into the streets. Picture waking up in your nice townhouse and realizing your basement had turned into a sewage swimming pool. Not exactly the Victorian dream. The problem wasn't just private cesspits, but also the open channels that doubled as makeshift sewers. Many of London's medieval ditches and drains had never been properly modernized. Instead of whisking waste away, they served as open-air troughs of filth running between houses or along the edges of streets. Rain would wash them along, spreading the contents into puddles and streams that crisscrossed neighborhoods. The result was a city where going for a walk often meant hopping, sidestepping, or flat-out sprinting to avoid stepping into someone else's digestive history. The smell was, unsurprisingly, legendary. Visitors described streets where the stench was so strong it clung to clothing long after leaving. Even Londoners, whose noses had been toughened by years of exposure, often complained that the city seemed to breathe sewage through every pore. Imagine living in a city where the wind didn't bring the sweet scent of flowers or the salt of the sea, but rather a helpful reminder of where your neighbor's privy emptied. Overflowing cesspits posed another sinister problem: explosions. Yes, you read that correctly. As waste decomposed, it produced methane gas. In tightly packed cesspits, that gas could build up until one spark, or even a careless lantern, caused the entire pit to erupt. Accounts survive of brick walls blown apart and houses damaged because someone's personal cesspool decided to fight back. Nothing says romantic evening quite like your backyard privy spontaneously combusting. Street channels, meanwhile, acted as a breeding ground for all sorts of unpleasant life. Flies swarmed, rats thrived, and dogs occasionally took it upon themselves to wallow in whatever the flow carried. Children, too, were not above splashing about in shallow gutters, either because they didn't know better or because there simply wasn't anywhere else to play. It's one of those details that makes you want to go back in time with a megaphone and yell, "For the love of soap, step away from that puddle." The irony was that some of these channels were technically improvements. The idea was to provide an outlet for rainwater, but in practice they became dumping grounds for everything: human waste, animal droppings, kitchen refuse, and industrial runoff. If you lived near a tannery or a butcher's shop, the channel outside your door could carry a mix of blood, fat, and dung flowing merrily past. Romantic poets didn't tend to wax lyrical about those streams. Naturally, disease was never far behind. Though the Victorians hadn't yet nailed down germ theory, they knew something was wrong. Outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid flourished in areas with the worst open sewers and cesspits. Poorer neighborhoods were hit hardest, where entire streets relied on a single overflowing ditch to carry away their waste. It didn't help that water pumps and wells were often located disturbingly close to these open drains. In effect, Londoners were drinking their own problem, and the city was paying the price in funerals. The wealthy weren't immune either. Waste didn't respect property lines, and the smell certainly didn't stop at garden gates. Even Parliament, perched proudly on the banks of the Thames, was forced to reckon with the city's sewage when the odor grew too strong to ignore. It was one thing for commoners to complain. It was another when politicians couldn't sit through a debate without gagging. Attempts at regulation were slow and often ineffective. Laws existed requiring cesspits to be cleaned regularly, but enforcement was patchy at best. Night soil men, tasked with emptying pits, couldn't keep up with the sheer volume. Many cesspits were simply abandoned, left to leak into the ground until they became subterranean hazards. Streets were occasionally flushed with water to clear away the filth, but without a proper sewage system, this was like sweeping dust under a rug made of manure. Reformers were horrified. Reports published in the mid-19th century painted a grim picture of a city drowning in its own waste. Doctors warned that cesspits were perpetual sources of effluvia poisoning the air. Journalists wrote scathing accounts of streets so foul they drove residents to nausea. And still, until Bazalgette's great sewer network began in the 1860s, cesspits and open sewers remained the city's default waste management plan. For the ordinary Londoner, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was life. You got used to stepping around puddles you didn't want to identify. You learned to breathe shallowly when the wind shifted. You prayed your cesspit didn't leak, explode, or overflow onto your shoes. It was a grim balancing act between necessity and disgust. So while we may romanticize Victorian London as a place of carriages, gas lamps, and grand boulevards, the truth ran beneath and beside every step. The streets may have carried the weight of empire, but they also carried the runoff of millions of stomachs. And until modern sewers arrived, London was quite literally a city whose foundation was built on filth. Forget the stock exchange. The real wealth of London was measured in dung heaps. Victorian London depended on horses the way modern cities depend on cars. They were the engines of the empire's capital, hauling carriages, omnibuses, delivery wagons and carts through every street. Thousands upon thousands of horses clattered across the cobblestones each day, their hooves ringing out like the heartbeat of the city. But with those hooves came another, less celebrated contribution: manure. Tons of it, piles of it, mountains of it. London didn't just run on horsepower, it drowned in the byproducts. Estimates suggest that by the mid-19th century, London's horse population stood at well over 300,000. That meant hundreds of thousands of animals producing waste daily, and not small amounts either. A single horse can produce 15 to 35 pounds of manure per day, plus several quarts of urine. Multiply that by the city's horse population, and you end up with millions of pounds of dung hitting the streets every single week. It was a logistical nightmare, and London never quite managed to get ahead of it. The evidence was everywhere. Streets were coated in a brown, uneven carpet of droppings churned under wheels and hooves until it mixed with rainwater to create a sticky sludge. Dry weather wasn't much better. The manure dried, crumbled, and blew into the air as dust, coating buildings, clothes, and lungs alike. Breathing in airborne horse wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was just Tuesday. For pedestrians, walking through London meant a constant dance of avoidance. Ladies lifted their skirts to keep hems out of filth, while gentlemen picked their way carefully around fresh piles hoping their boots didn't slip. But inevitably, everyone got caught sooner or later. Imagine spending half an hour polishing your shoes, only to have a carriage horse undo your work in a single clop. Children, less fussy than adults, often played in the muck, treating the manure-streaked streets like an adventure ground. It was less tag you're it and more tag you're covered. The smell was a constant backdrop to urban life. Fresh manure wasn't entirely unpleasant. It had a barnyard earthiness to it, but in the quantities produced in London, it quickly became overwhelming. Add in urine, rain-soaked dung, and days-old piles slowly rotting in the sun, and the city developed a stench so powerful it seemed to have its own personality. Visitors commented on the way London smelled of horse, as though the animals themselves had marked the city as their own. Manure heaps grew in corners, alleys, and open lots, where collectors dumped what they swept off the main thoroughfares. These piles could reach astonishing sizes, sometimes towering higher than nearby houses. For scavengers and waste collectors, they were an opportunity. Manure was valuable as fertilizer, and often carted to farms outside the city, but the supply so outstripped demand that much of it simply sat there steaming away. Imagine walking past what looked like a small hill, only to realize it was a monument to equine digestion. Horses didn't just produce manure, they produced danger. Their waste made roads slippery, causing carriages to skid and pedestrians to tumble. Injuries from falls were common, and if you were especially unlucky, you could find yourself face first in something less than sanitary. Horse urine added another hazard. soaking into wooden pavements or cobblestones until surfaces warped, cracked, and stank. And then there were the flies. Swarms of them bred in the endless supply of manure, spreading disease from pile to plate. It wasn't unusual to sit down to a meal and find a fly buzzing happily over your bread, fresh from a dung heap outside. Flies were the silent middlemen in London's cycle of filth, ensuring that the smell and the germs travelled as efficiently as the empire's trains. Yet, for all its drawbacks, horse manure was big business. Entrepreneurs tried to find uses for it beyond farming. Some used it as fuel, others experimented with turning it into building material. Newspapers worried that London would soon be buried alive under its own dung unless solutions were found. One infamous prediction in the late 1890s suggested that within 50 years, London's streets would be buried under 9 feet of manure. It was called the Great Horse Manure Crisis, a looming apocalypse of dung that seemed all too believable. It was only the rise of motor vehicles in the early 20th century that finally saved London from its manure mountains. Cars, buses, and electric trams gradually replaced horses, sweeping away the city's greatest source of filth. But during the Victorian era, there was no such relief. Horses were indispensable, and so was their waste. For ordinary Londoners, it was just part of life. You got used to the sight of dung piles steaming in the morning air. You grew accustomed to brushing dried flecks of manure off your trousers before work. You learned to walk quickly and breathe shallowly when crossing particularly busy intersections. The smell of manure became as much a part of London's identity as Big Ben or St. Paul's. So while the Victorians dreamed of empire, invention, and progress, their boots told a different story, one of a city where wealth and power trotted hand in hoof with filth. London may have been the centre of the modern world, but on the streets it was still a barn. It was the original flavoured water, the flavour being disease. The River Thames was the heart of London. It carried ships, powered trade, and inspired poets. But for much of the 19th century, it also carried something less romantic: raw sewage. The river that gave life to the city doubled as its ultimate dumping ground. In an age before proper sewage treatment, the Thames was less a symbol of purity and more a long, winding toilet with delusions of grandeur. Londoners relied on the Thames for nearly everything. It provided drinking water, a highway for goods, and even a place for recreation. Families strolled along its embankments, fishermen cast their lines into its waters, and boatmen ferried passengers back and forth. On the surface, it looked like a thriving river at the heart of a global capital. But beneath that surface lurked horrors. By the Victorian period, the Thames was absorbing the combined output of millions of people, thousands of animals, and countless industries. Everything the city didn't want found its way into the river, whether by cesspits leaking underground, sewers emptying directly into its flow, or people tossing refuse in with little thought. Water companies added insult to injury. They pumped water straight from the river to supply homes, often downstream from where sewers discharged. This created a system so ludicrous it almost feels like satire. Londoners drank from the same river they used as a toilet. Imagine filling a glass of water while watching someone upstream dump out a bucket of waste. For many Victorians, that wasn't imagination, it was Tuesday. The result was a deadly cocktail. The Thames became a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. Outbreaks of cholera repeatedly swept through the city in the 19th century, each one leaving devastation in its wake. Entire families perished within days of drinking infected water. At first, authorities blamed the stench. Miasma theory, after all, held that foul smells spread illness. It took the pioneering work of figures like Dr. John Snow, who traced a cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump in Soho in 1854, to prove that the real culprit was the water itself. But until those ideas took root, Londoners continued sipping their daily dose of flavoured water. The appearance of the Thames left little doubt as to its condition. Observers described the river as thick, black, and sluggish. At low tide, its banks revealed heaps of rotting refuse, animal carcasses, and a shimmering film of grease. In warm weather, the smell intensified until it seemed the whole city was marinated in sewage. Foreign visitors, expecting the noble Thames of Shakespeare's verse, instead found a river that looked and smelled like something scraped from the bottom of a pot. Industries along the banks contributed their share of poison. Tanneries dumped chemicals, breweries poured out waste mash, and slaughterhouses let blood and offal drain directly into the current. The river became an open conveyor belt of pollution, carrying with it the detritus of every trade. Even cemeteries weren't innocent. In some cases, overfilled graveyards near the banks leaked into the water, giving new meaning to the phrase "drinking with the ancestors." And yet, despite its foulness, people still used the Thames daily. Bargamen and lightermen worked its waters, hauling goods and coal. Fishermen tried their luck, though the catch was often more pollution than protein. Children swam in the river during hot summers, splashing and laughing in what was essentially liquid disease. It's hard not to cringe imagining the blissful ignorance of a boy cannonballing into the same stretch where a butcher had dumped animal guts an hour earlier. The stench of the Thames was legendary. It didn't just linger along the banks, it invaded the city. Windows facing the river had to be shut tight in summer, curtains soaked in chemicals, and handkerchiefs pressed to noses. Even Parliament couldn't escape. By the 1850s, the smell inside the House of Commons grew so unbearable that debates were shortened or abandoned altogether. Laws may shape empires, but sewage can silence politicians. Public opinion gradually reached a tipping point. The Thames was no longer just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. Reformers called it a national disgrace that the capital of the world's greatest empire had a river fit for neither drinking nor looking at. Newspapers ran scathing reports, describing the river as a pestiferous and typhus-breeding abomination. Writers lamented that the once proud Thames had been reduced to a foul ditch of filth. And yet, amid all this, the river endured as a paradox. It was simultaneously the source of London's prosperity and the cause of its greatest suffering. The city couldn't abandon it, it was too vital for trade and transport. But until Bazalgette's Great Sewer Project redirected waste elsewhere in the 1860s, London had little choice but to live with the Thames as it was, an open sewer, carrying away the evidence of a metropolis too big for its own sanitation. So while the Thames still flowed proudly under London Bridge, it did so with an aroma that made even the most patriotic Londoner wrinkle their nose. Shakespeare once called it Silver Thames. By the Victorian age, it was more brown sludge Thames, still central, still mighty, but undeniably smelly. In the summer of 1858, London experienced one of the most infamous environmental disasters in its history, the Great Stink. For centuries, the Thames had carried the city's waste, both politely and impolitely deposited. But that year, nature, weather, and human negligence combined into a crescendo of stench so overwhelming, it brought the world's most powerful government to its knees, literally gagging. It began innocently enough with sunshine. Normally, London's unpredictable climate kept the river's smell manageable, if not pleasant. But the summer of 1858 was unusually hot and dry, without rain to dilute or wash away the waste. The Thames became a slow-moving soup of sewage. Temperatures soared into the 90s Fahrenheit, effectively cooking the river. What had once been foul became unbearable, and then by July, apocalyptic. Eyewitnesses described the Thames as a dark, oozing sludge that reeked like a rotting corpse. Its surface shimmered with grease, while bloated animal carcasses bobbed along with whatever refuse the city had thrown in. One journalist claimed the smell was so powerful it was a phenomenon to be remembered for a lifetime. Visitors said you could taste the stench, as if the very air had dissolved into sewage particles. Londoners joked darkly that if you fell into the Thames, you'd emerge with fewer friends and fewer internal organs. The odor spread far beyond the riverbanks. It seeped into houses, clung to clothing, and settled in the back of throats. Families along the Thames fled their homes. Shopkeepers near the embankments shut up their businesses. Even hospitals reported patients growing worse simply from exposure to the stench. Yet the most dramatic impact was felt in Westminster, where the Houses of Parliament perched proudly on the very edge of the river. Inside the Commons, members of Parliament struggled to carry on their business. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime to mask the smell, but the effort was laughably inadequate. MPs gagged, choked, and pressed handkerchiefs to their noses as the stench wafted in through every window. Meetings were shortened, debates abandoned, and the very machinery of government ground to a halt, not because of revolution, invasion, or scandal, but because the river beneath their windows had turned into liquid death. The world's most powerful empire was in effect defeated by its own sewage. The press, as always, had a field day. Newspapers ridiculed the government for tolerating such a crisis. Satirical cartoons depicted MPs holding their noses or fleeing chambers in disgust. One paper quipped that the Thames was now the largest and most pestilent open sewer in existence. Others warned, more seriously, that disease was inevitable if nothing was done. Public outrage grew alongside the smell, and for once politicians could not ignore it. The Great Stink wasn't just a sensory crisis, it was a turning point. For decades, reformers had pleaded for London to modernize its sanitation. Engineers and doctors had published reports, warning that cesspits and open drains were killing the city. But change had been slow, blocked by bureaucracy, cost and denial. Now, with the stench literally choking the lawmakers, excuses ran out. The crisis cut through political inertia like a knife through rancid butter. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, the engineer whose name deserves a far better-smelling legacy. In the wake of the Great Stink, Parliament finally approved funding for his ambitious plan, a massive sewer network that would intercept waste before it reached the Thames and carry it downstream, far from the heart of the city. It was an enormous project, involving miles of underground brick tunnels, pumping stations and embankments that reshaped London itself. Construction would take years, but the Great Stink ensured it happened. Without that summer's olfactory assault, reform might have taken decades longer. Ironically, the very event that made London nearly unlivable secured the future health and safety of its population. The Great Stink was, in its own pungent way, the best thing that could have happened to the city. Still, the memory lingered. For those who lived through it, the summer of 1858 was burned into their nostrils. Letters, diaries, and official reports all struggled to capture the sheer potency of the smell. One writer claimed that even miles away, the effluvia pursued me like a spectre. Another noted grimly that London had become a city with death in its breath. The Great Stink also left a cultural legacy. It became shorthand for everything wrong with the city's infrastructure. Proof that progress in railways, factories, and empire meant little if the capital couldn't keep its river from becoming a cesspool. It exposed the hypocrisy of a government that boasted of ruling the seas while failing to clean the river flowing past its own front door. And perhaps most importantly, it gave us a rare historical moment of comedy. For one glorious summer, all the pomp and power of Victorian politics was undone by the humble, unstoppable force of human waste. Kings and queens could reign, armies could march, but in 1858, the real ruler of London was the stink. Air so thick you could chew it. London invented the snackable atmosphere. When we picture Victorian London, we often imagine foggy streets lit by flickering gas lamps, Sherlock Holmes disappearing into the mist, or lovers strolling under a haze that makes everything look mysterious and romantic. The truth was less poetic. That fog was mostly coal smoke, mixed with industrial fumes, turning the air into a broth of soot, sulfur, and unpronounceable chemicals. Far from being dreamy, it was the world's first example of atmospheric fast food, quick, cheap, and terrible for your health. The fuel of choice in 19th century London was coal, and not the clean burning kind. This was soft, smoky coal hauled in by the ton from British mines, piled into furnaces, fireplaces, and factory boilers. Every home, no matter how small, relied on coal fires for heat and cooking. Every factory belched smoke through tall chimneys that dotted the skyline like exclamation points of filth. By mid-century, London consumed millions of tons of coal annually, and most of it ended up in the air. The result was smog, though Victorians called it pea soup. The nickname was painfully accurate. The air could be so thick and yellow-brown that visibility dropped to mere feet. People described walking through clouds that clung to their clothes, hair, and eyelashes. If you've ever tried to find your way through a room filled with burnt toast smoke, imagine that but stretching for miles, and you'll have some idea of what a bad smog day in London was like. Breathing was another matter. The air irritated throats, stung eyes, and coated tongues in a gritty residue. Residents complained that even indoors, coal dust seeped through windows and chimneys, settling on furniture and food alike. Eating dinner sometimes meant picking soot flakes out of your soup, as if the city itself had added seasoning. For the working poor, who lived in neighborhoods closest to factories, lungs became unwilling filters. Chronic coughing was so common it might as well have been the city's unofficial anthem. Factories contributed more than just coal smoke. Tanneries, chemical works, dye houses, and gas plants added their own bouquet of odors. Sulfur and ammonia burned the nostrils, while acidic vapors corroded metal railings and stained stone facades. The stench of industry could be overpowering, especially in districts like Southwark or Bermondsey, where manufacturing clustered tightly together. Travellers wrote of being nearly knocked unconscious by the combination of smoke and chemical fumes. It was less welcome to London and more brace yourself. And then there was the filth that didn't just vanish into the air. Factories poured liquid waste directly into streams, ditches, and of course the Thames. Slaughterhouses let blood and offal flow into drains. Breweries dumped leftover mash, and soap makers discharged alkaline runoff. The ground itself became saturated with chemical residues, producing strange colors and smells in unexpected places. Children grew up thinking rainbow-colored puddles were normal. Industrial pollution didn't just make life unpleasant, it made it dangerous. Respiratory diseases flourished. Bronchitis, asthma, and tuberculosis thrived in the smoggy conditions. Death rates spiked during the worst fogs, when lungs simply couldn't cope with the toxic brew. Doctors began linking soot-choked air to premature deaths, though the exact mechanisms weren't fully understood until much later. In working-class districts, coughing children were as common a sight as chimneys. The visual toll was also striking. Buildings blackened quickly under constant soot, losing their original stone colors to a uniform shade of charcoal gray. Monuments, churches, and homes looked centuries older than they were, weathered not by time but by industry. White laundry hung outside was doomed. Clotheslines might as well have been smoke filters. Housewives joked bitterly that washing day was pointless, since fresh sheets could turn grey within hours. And yet, despite the obvious damage, coal smoke was seen as a sign of prosperity. Where there's muck, there's brass, went the saying, meaning dirt and profit went hand in hand. Belching chimneys were celebrated as symbols of progress, proof that Britain's economy was thriving. Industrialists pointed proudly to the smoke as the breath of empire. After all, it powered trains, lit lamps, and filled factories with work. Complaining about pollution was sometimes dismissed as unpatriotic, as if disliking coal smoke was the same as disliking Britain itself. Reformers, however, were less impressed. Writers like Charles Dickens filled their novels with images of choking smog and grimy workers. Journalists railed against the fogs that kill. Health advocates warned that children growing up in such conditions faced stunted lungs and shortened lives. But practical solutions were scarce. Reducing coal consumption was unthinkable. It was the lifeblood of industry. Cleaner fuels weren't available at scale, and legislation was slow to arrive. Londoners were stuck breathing their prosperity, one gritty gulp at a time. For ordinary people, adaptation became the only strategy. Gentlemen carried handkerchiefs to cover their mouths and noses. Women dabbed vinegar on sponges or kerchiefs to block the stench. In heavy smog, lamplighters struggled to find the very lamps they were supposed to light. Street accidents multiplied. Carriages collided. Pedestrians stumbled into ditches, and police struggled to patrol when they could barely see their own boots. For some, fog meant opportunity. Thieves and pickpockets used the cover to vanish into the haze, leaving victims coughing and squinting into the void. And yet, amid the misery, Victorians found a strange sense of identity in their smog. Artists painted misty cityscapes, poets rhapsodized about fog, and London's atmospheric gloom became part of its cultural image. Outsiders might wrinkle their noses, but for Londoners, The smoky air was a badge of resilience, a reminder that they lived at the heart of the industrial world, even if it left them hacking up soot between stanzas of poetry. So while industrial pollution dimmed the skies and blackened the walls, it also defined the Victorian city. London wasn't just the capital of an empire. It was the world's largest coal-fired machine, running hot and dirty. The price of progress was written in the air itself, in every cough, every smudged building, and every spoonful of soup seasoned with soot. Meat markets gave you two choices: eat it fast or smell it forever. Victorian London was a city of appetite. Feeding millions of mouths meant meat, lots of it. Beef, mutton, pork and poultry poured into the capital daily, not from neatly packaged portions in refrigerated trucks, but from live animals driven into the city and butchered almost on the spot. Slaughterhouses and butchers were everywhere, their presence impossible to ignore, and their smells even harder to forget. Unlike today, when abattoirs are tucked away far from city centres, in 19th century London, the slaughterhouse was often just down the street. Animals were herded through narrow alleys, bleating and mooing their way into pens before meeting their end in courtyards or sheds attached to shops. Blood flowed freely, sometimes pooling in gutters, while offal, the less desirable bits, piled up in heaps waiting to be carted off. These were not tidy, sanitized operations. They were open, visceral, and very much part of the city's sensory landscape. The smell was a symphony of decay. Freshly killed meat had its own iron tang, but combined with the odors of hides, fat, and innards, it produced a stench that clung to the air long after the last cut had been made. Add in summer heat, poor drainage, and the ever-present flies, and the streets around butcher shops became olfactory war zones. Shoppers arriving in search of tonight's dinner often had to wade through puddles of diluted blood, hoping their boots survived the trip. Markets amplified the problem. Smithfield, the largest meat market in London, was legendary. It had been operating since the Middle Ages, and by the Victorian period it was a spectacle of chaos. Animals were slaughtered in staggering numbers, and the market thrummed with the noise of shouting sellers, squealing pigs, and the clang of cleavers on chopping blocks. For miles around, the air smelled of meat, and not in the pleasant way of a Sunday roast. It was the smell of animal guts exposed to open air, meat slowly spoiling before it could be sold, and waste accumulating faster than it could be removed. This lack of refrigeration was a major issue. Without ice or cooling systems, meat had to be sold quickly. In colder months it might keep for a while, but in summer it spoiled almost as soon as it arrived. Shoppers were advised to buy early, cook fast, and ignore the suspicious tinge of grey on yesterday's beef. Vendors tried to disguise meat that had turned by rubbing it with salt, trimming away the worst bits, or slathering it in gravy to mask the taste. It was less about quality dining and more about culinary Russian roulette. Waste management was equally dire. Bones, skins and entrails piled up behind shops, often left for dogs, rats or enterprising children to scavenge. Offal might be sold cheaply to the poor, who turned it into stews and pies, but the scraps no one wanted became a problem. Cartmen collected the remains, but not quickly enough to prevent heaps from rotting in alleyways. On hot days, the smell was so strong it could drive residents to nausea. One commentator wrote that living near a slaughterhouse was like dwelling in a charnel house with a butcher for a landlord. Blood was another hazard. With so many animals killed daily, rivers of it flowed into drains and ditches, sometimes staining nearby streams crimson. During heavy rains, diluted blood mixed with street runoff, creating ghastly puddles that horrified passers-by. Children, with the casual bravery of the poor, sometimes splashed in these gutters as if they were harmless mud. Parents may have scolded, but in truth, when every street reeked of something, you could only police so much. Butchers themselves became synonymous with grime. Aprons were perpetually stained red, knives and cleavers rarely spotless, and their shops decorated with dangling carcasses that swayed in the breeze like grotesque chandeliers. Customers grew used to swatting away flies as they examined cuts of meat, trying to guess which ones were freshest by sight alone. Freshness was often a relative term. The only guarantee was that if it didn't smell too awful, it was probably edible. The cultural reaction was divided. On the one hand, meat was central to the Victorian diet, a symbol of prosperity and strength. Beef in particular was tied to British identity. Caricatures of the time portrayed the stout, hearty John Bull figure, feasting on beef as the embodiment of national vigour. On the other hand, reformers and social critics were appalled by the filth and cruelty of the trade. They pointed to slaughterhouses as sources of disease, moral corruption, and sheer disgust. Charles Dickens himself described Smithfield as a place of offal and blood, hideous cruelty and filth. Reform did come eventually. In the mid-19th century, efforts were made to move slaughterhouses out of residential areas and centralize them in larger, regulated facilities. The opening of the modern Smithfield Meat Market building in 1868 marked a step toward cleanliness, with better drainage and more control over the trade. But for much of the Victorian period, the sights and smells of butchery remained woven into the fabric of urban life. For ordinary Londoners, meat shopping was a paradox. On the one hand, it was a chance to indulge in hearty food that symbolized health and success. On the other, it was a sensory ordeal, forcing you to step over puddles of blood and ignore the buzzing clouds of flies. You could take home a joint of beef, but the smell of the market lingered on your clothes, your hair, and probably your nightmares. So next time you admire a gleaming supermarket aisle or neatly wrapped steaks in plastic trays, remember that Victorian Londoners faced a very different reality. Their meat markets were not only sources of sustenance, but also fountains of stench. Progress for them meant learning to live with a city where dinner didn't just sit on the table, it dripped, rotted, and reeked in the street outside. Breakfast didn't energize you, it challenged your digestive bravery. Victorian Londoners needed to eat, and with millions of mouths to feed, food markets sprang up across the city. They bustled with energy, hawkers shouting prices, baskets brimming with produce, barrels of fish thumped down with dramatic flair. On the surface, these markets promised abundance, but step a little closer, and the abundance came with a catch. Much of it was rotting before it reached your plate. Fish was one of the worst offenders. Without refrigeration, the journey from sea to stall was a race against time, and time usually won. Fish caught off the coasts of Britain had to be carted, trained or boated into London, often taking days. By the time it reached Billingsgate, the city's great fish market, freshness was a fantasy. The market reeked of decay. Contemporary accounts describe the overpowering odor of thousands of fish lying on slabs in varying states of decomposition, their glassy eyes staring blankly, their bodies softening into mush. The cobblestones ran slick with fish guts, and the air was alive with gulls, rats, and flies all competing for their share. Billingsgate was infamous. It was noisy, chaotic, and stank so strongly that the word Billingsgate itself became shorthand for vulgarity and foulness. Hawkers, often women known as fishwives, shouted in coarse language as they haggled and berated customers, their voices cutting through the din. For locals, the market was just part of life. For outsiders, it was a sensory assault that lingered in memory long after the smell had left their clothes, if it ever did. Fish wasn't the only culprit. Fruit and vegetables had their own stinking secrets. With transport slow and storage poor, produce often arrived overripe, bruised, or half-rotten. Bananas and oranges, imported luxuries, sometimes arrived more brown than yellow. Apples and pears bruised in carts often oozed before they were sold. For the poor, spoiled food was often the only affordable option. Vendors cut prices on the worst of it, offering what we might call pre-compost bargains. Eating such food wasn't about enjoyment, it was about survival and a strong stomach. Meat pies and street food added to the risk. Vendors sold hot snacks from stalls or baskets, but with questionable ingredients. A penny pie might contain scraps of dubious origin, bits of spoiled meat disguised under pastry and seasoning. One critic quipped that many pies contained the mysterious animal known as the street cat. True or not, the point was clear. Food hygiene wasn't a priority. If it was hot and filling, that was good enough. Storage was another problem. Before refrigeration, preservation relied on salt, smoking, or pickling. Fish soaked in brine was common, but if not done properly, it spoiled anyway, leaving a taste somewhere between inedible and weaponized. Vegetables and fruits were stored in cellars, where dampness encouraged mold, and since much food was displayed openly at stalls, it was exposed to the city's smoke, flies, and occasional showers of chamber pot contents from above. Eating in Victorian London wasn't just nourishment, it was a gamble. For the poor, rotten food wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a diet. Refuse markets thrived where the unsellable scraps from larger stalls were hawked cheaply. These included half-rotten vegetables, broken eggs, or meat already turning green around the edges. Housewives would buy these, cut away the worst bits, and stretch them into meals. It was a daily test of resourcefulness. How to make soup from ingredients that looked like they belonged in a compost heap. Unsurprisingly, foodborne illness was rampant. Cases of food poisoning, dysentery, and stomach cramps plagued the population. Doctors and reformers railed against the lack of food safety, but enforcement was almost non-existent until later in the century. Some unscrupulous vendors actively cheated customers by refreshing rotten food, wiping down old fish with vinegar, soaking vegetables in water to make them look plump, or coloring spoiled meat with dyes. It was the Victorian equivalent of photoshopping your dinner, except you paid for it with nausea. Markets also revealed a striking contrast between rich and poor diets. Wealthier Londoners had access to private suppliers, better storage, and fresher food delivered directly to their homes. For them, fish might actually resemble something caught that week. For the working classes, however, dinner often came from a stall where freshness was more rumor than reality. The divide wasn't just about taste, it was about health. Spoiled food hit the poor hardest, while the rich dined on relative safety. The smells of these markets became part of London's character. Imagine walking through a city square, where the air was thick with a blend of rotting fish, bruised fruit, sour milk, and reheated pies. To modern noses it would be unbearable. To Victorians, it was simply market day. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts for a taste of sweets or apples, while dogs snatched at discarded scraps. Amid the chaos, people bartered, laughed, argued, and somehow made meals out of what was available. Yet, despite the foulness, markets were vital. They provided cheap sustenance to the poor, variety to the rich, and livelihoods to thousands of sellers. Without them, the city couldn't have fed itself. The smell, the rot, the risk, it was the price Londoners paid for living in the largest metropolis on earth. So next time you walk through a supermarket with climate-controlled aisles, misted vegetables, and expiration dates printed neatly on packaging, remember Victorian London. For them, breakfast wasn't about choosing between Cheerios or toast. It was about daring to eat the fish that smelled only slightly less like death than yesterday's catch. Fashion came at a price mostly paid by your nose. Leather was everywhere in Victorian London. Boots, belts, gloves, saddles, and the bindings of books. The empire marched, rode, and accessorized on leather, but behind every fine pair of boots or elegant satchel was an industry that produced some of the worst smells in the city, the tanneries. If slaughterhouses were bad, the processing of hides after the kill was a whole new league of disgusting. Tanning was an ancient craft, but in 19th century London it remained stubbornly primitive. The raw hides of animals arrived fresh from butchers and slaughterhouses, often with bits of flesh and fat still clinging to them. They had to be preserved before rotting set in, and this was done through methods that would horrify even the most resilient nose. Hides were soaked in vats of urine, lime, or dog dung, sometimes all three. The idea was to loosen hair, soften the skin, and prepare it for the long curing process. The result was a stench so vile it could clear a street. Whole districts reeked of tanning. Bermondsey, in South London, was especially notorious. It was nicknamed London's larder because of its food processing industries, but locals joked it was more like London's armpit. Travellers wrote of being nearly overcome by the smell drifting across the river, describing it as a mix of sour ammonia, rancid fat, and decay. Residents grew so accustomed to the odor that they barely noticed it, but visitors gagged, covered their noses or fled. The process was as grim as it was smelly. Workers began by soaking hides in pits of lime to loosen hair and flesh. They then scraped the hides with knives, removing what clung stubbornly to the surface. Next came the infamous bait, a soaking in fermented dog dung or chicken droppings. Yes, you read that correctly, animal excrement. This softened the hides, making them pliable for later stages. Imagine standing knee-deep in vats of dung soup, day after day, and you'll understand why tanners weren't exactly the darlings of polite society. After the baiting, hides were steeped for weeks or months in tannin-rich liquids made from oak bark. These tanning pits gave the leather its durability, but also added their own earthy, sour smell. Combined with the lingering traces of urine and dung, the final aroma of a tannery was something no amount of Victorian perfume could disguise. It clung to the workers themselves, who were often described as carrying the smell of their trade wherever they went. One wit remarked that you could identify a tanner from across the street without ever seeing his face. The physical environment of tanneries only added to the horror. Large open pits filled courtyards, the liquid inside frothing with chemicals and organic matter. Slippery floors, piles of discarded scraps and clouds of flies completed the scene. Workers endured constant exposure to caustic substances, which burned their skin and weakened their health. Cuts or sores could easily become infected. Many tanners developed chronic illnesses or simply died young. If the smell didn't kill you, the job itself probably would. Yet leather was indispensable. Victorian society demanded shoes, boots, harnesses, and fashionable accessories, and someone had to make them. Tanneries were an accepted nuisance. People complained, but they also bought the goods. The irony was palpable. A lady could turn up her nose at the stench of Bermondsey, all while strutting about in gloves that had been steeped in dog dung. Beyond the smell, the industry also polluted the environment. Runoff from tanneries leached into nearby streams and drains, carrying with it lime, dung, and chemical waste. Local water sources became undrinkable, and the ground itself stank. Rats thrived on the scraps, and whole neighborhoods suffered from the proximity of these odorous manufactories. Reformers called them breeding grounds of disease, but relocation was slow. The city couldn't do without leather, and the workers couldn't do without their wages. The social status of tanners reflected their trade. They were essential craftsmen, but often despised by their neighbors. Many lived in poor housing near the tanneries themselves, constantly exposed to the very smells others avoided. Marriage prospects for tanners' sons and daughters weren't always bright after all. Who wanted to marry into a family that reeked of dung and decay? Still, communities formed, with generations working the same pits. It was a hard life, but it was steady work in a city where poverty was always waiting around the corner. Interestingly, the stink even became a kind of dark humor. Writers mocked the perfume of Bermondsey as something uniquely London, while cartoonists lampooned fashionable people who couldn't escape the origins of their leather. The contradiction was glaring. Victorian society prided itself on refinement, yet its elegance literally stank. By the late 19th century, some improvements came. Advances in chemistry reduced the reliance on dung, and larger, more centralized factories began to replace small urban tanneries. Still, for much of the Victorian era, the process remained stubbornly medieval. A pair of polished boots might shine in a West End ballroom, but their journey began in a pit of urine and excrement tended by men who lived and died in the shadow of their trade. So the next time you admire leather shoes, belts, or a fine-bound book, remember the Victorians. For them, fashion wasn't just about taste or expense. It was about enduring the reek of tanning pits that soaked hides in concoctions only a nose could truly hate. Style, in London, always had a smell, and it wasn't pleasant. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but making soap smelled like you'd angered both. If the slaughterhouses and tanneries hadn't already filled your nostrils, rendering plants were waiting to finish the job. These were the hidden engines of Victorian cleanliness and illumination, the places where animal fat was boiled down into soap and candles. Londoners may have scrubbed with soap and dined by candlelight, but they paid for those luxuries in the coin of stench. Rendering was, in theory, simple. Take animal fat, whether from cows, pigs or sheep, and melt it down. Separate the grease from the impurities, then use it as the base for soap, candles and other products. In practice, this was anything but simple. Imagine giant cauldrons of fat bubbling away in yards and workshops, clouds of greasy steam rising into the air, and vats filled with bones, gristle, and offcuts. Now imagine those cauldrons tipped over or left unattended in summer heat. The smell didn't just linger, it attacked. The raw material came straight from slaughterhouses and butchers, meaning it was already halfway to rotten by the time it reached rendering plants. Animal carcasses, skins and scraps were piled high, left to fester until workers could toss them into boiling vats. Dogs prowled the perimeters, hoping for a stray bone, while rats feasted openly. Flies swarmed in such numbers that workers described them as a living cloud. And then the boiling began. The fat gave off a thick, acrid odor that clung to skin and clothing. Anyone walking past could identify a rendering plant with their eyes closed and likely wished they hadn't opened their lungs. Soap making added its own bouquet of horror. Early Victorian soap was made by combining animal fat with lye, a caustic substance that burned skin and eyes if handled carelessly. Workers stirred steaming vats with long paddles, sweating profusely while trying to avoid splashes. The fumes from boiling fat and lye stung throats and left workers coughing. For neighbors, the smell was worse than the dangers. They lived with the constant reek of boiling grease, like living inside a giant frying pan someone had forgotten to clean. Candles weren't any kinder on the nose. Before paraffin wax became common, candles were made from tallow, the rendered fat of sheep and cows. Tallow candles smoked when burned, leaving greasy soot on walls and ceilings. They also carried a faint whiff of the slaughterhouse, meaning that even the genteel glow of evening light came with the ghost of animal fat. Wealthier Londoners preferred beeswax candles, which smelled sweeter, but these were far more expensive. For the poor, tallow was the only affordable option, and with it came a home scented like a butcher's shop. Rendering plants also spilled their byproducts into the environment. Wastewater from boiling pits flowed into drains and streams, carrying grease and blood with it. Thick scum collected on the surface of nearby water sources, creating rainbow sheens that might look beautiful if they hadn't smelled like decomposition. Workers dumped bones and unusable scraps into open heaps, where they rotted in the sun until carted away or scavenged by animals. The line between industry and garbage dump was thin, and neighbors bore the brunt. The human toll was real. Rendering was grueling work, hot and filthy, with constant exposure to foul smells and dangerous substances. Cuts and burns were common, and chemical exposure left lasting scars. The smell clung to workers so stubbornly that they were often avoided in public, much like tanners or night soil men. A soap boiler's handshake was a literal mark of their trade, rough, scarred, and faintly greasy. They might keep the city clean, but they themselves rarely escaped the odor of their profession. Culturally, the irony was delicious. Soap symbolized cleanliness, respectability, and even morality. Middle-class Victorians preached about the importance of washing, connecting it with virtue and decency. Advertisements boasted of soap as a hallmark of progress, yet the production of this purity depended on some of the dirtiest, smelliest labor imaginable. Every bar of soap carried a history of blood, fat, and chemical fumes. Every candle that lit a parlour whispered of the boiling pits of Bermondsey and Whitechapel. Neighbours, of course, complained. Letters poured into local councils describing the unbearable conditions. One commentator described the stench of rendering plants as a pestilence in itself, but since soap and candles were essential, authorities tolerated the industry, often turning a blind eye. In the tug-of-war between noses and necessity, necessity usually won. By the later 19th century, improvements in chemistry and industry brought some relief. The rise of paraffin candles and advances in soap production reduced dependence on raw tallow. Factories grew larger and more regulated, pushing some of the worst-smelling processes out of residential neighborhoods. But for much of the Victorian age, rendering was simply part of London life. You might wrinkle your nose, but you'd still buy the soap. For the ordinary Londoner, there was no escaping it. The streets carried the smell of boiling fat, and the smoke of tallow candles darkened walls. Cleanliness and light were luxuries, but they were luxuries bought at the cost of enduring some of the most nauseating industries the city ever hosted. So next time you light a candle or lather your hands with soap, remember Victorian London. For them, the glow of evening and the scent of cleanliness were built on a foundation of fat, fumes, and filth. Fashion may have cost your nose, but in this case so did hygiene. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but you could smell the guy next to you. If there was one thing more iconic than Big Ben or Buckingham Palace, it was London's fog. Painters romanticized it, poets wrote about it, and novelists gave it a starring role. But this was no ordinary mist drifting prettily off the Thames. Victorian fog was a monster born from the marriage of weather and pollution. A choking, clinging smog so thick it swallowed entire streets. London's geography made it vulnerable. Nestled in a damp river valley, the city was already prone to natural fog, but once coal smoke from millions of chimneys and factories joined in, those mists thickened into something far more sinister. Water vapor bound with soot and sulfur particles, hanging in the air like a dirty curtain. What might have been a soft grey haze elsewhere became, in London, a greenish-brown soup that assaulted the lungs and blinded the eyes. These pea soupers, as they were nicknamed, could last for days. Imagine waking up to find your street vanished. Gas lamps glowed dimly like dying stars, visible only a few feet away. Carriages crawled at walking pace, drivers squinting to avoid collisions. Pedestrians stumbled into lampposts, gutters, or each other, reduced to groping their way through the gloom. More than one unlucky soul stepped straight into the Thames or was trampled by a horse they never even saw coming. The danger wasn't just getting lost. Breathing in the fog meant inhaling coal dust, soot, and sulfur dioxide. Throats burned, eyes watered, and lungs filled with grit. Doctors reported spikes in bronchitis and asthma whenever fogs rolled in. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable, coughing violently as though their bodies were trying to expel the city itself. People described the sensation as swallowing smoke with every breath. It was like chain smoking without the courtesy of a cigarette. The smell was unforgettable. Unlike fresh country fog which carries the scent of grass or rain, London's smog stank of smoke, chemicals and damp rot. Step outside, and you could instantly identify what the city had been burning the night before. Coal wasn't subtle. It clung to clothes, hair, and even food. Housewives complained that meals tasted of soot if cooked on foggy days, as though the smog had pulled up a chair at the dinner table. Yet, remarkably, fog became part of the city's character. Artists like James McNeill Whistler painted hazy riverside scenes, transforming choking smog into atmospheric beauty. Writers from Dickens to Conan Doyle used fog to set mood, mysterious, threatening, or melancholy. Tourists arriving from abroad often commented on the fog before anything else, noting how London seemed perpetually draped in a veil of smoke. For better or worse, smog was as much a symbol of the city as red buses are today. Daily life under these conditions was surreal. Shops and businesses sometimes closed early because customers couldn't find them. Police officers carried lanterns at chest level to guide pedestrians, creating glowing points of light floating in the gloom. Workers in the docks and factories pressed on regardless, coughing through their shifts because wages waited on the other side of the haze. Meanwhile, the criminal class thrived. Fog provided perfect cover for pickpockets and muggers. A thief could vanish after snatching a purse, swallowed whole by the smog within seconds. The London particular, as fog was sometimes called, became a partner in crime. Some of the worst fogs were effectively public health disasters. In dense conditions, death rates spiked, hospitals filled with patients struggling to breathe. The poor, crammed into unhealthy housing and already weakened by malnutrition, suffered the most. Newspapers printed grim statistics but often couched them in the familiar resignation of Victorian stoicism. Everyone knew fog was dangerous, but it was also inevitable, like taxes or nosy neighbours. And yet, despite its dangers, fog was oddly beloved. Many Londoners grew up with it, accepted it, even felt nostalgic for it. To them it was part of the city's soul. The very inconveniences of fog became stories to tell, jokes to share, or material for literature. Outsiders might complain, but locals shrugged and pulled their scarves tighter. If you could survive London fog, you could survive anything. By the late Victorian period, reformers began to connect the dots between coal smoke, fog, and poor health. Scientists studied the composition of smog, while politicians debated how much industry should be allowed to pollute the air. But meaningful change came slowly. Coal remained king, and the fog remained the city's unwanted but inseparable companion. For those who lived through it, London's smog was unforgettable. It blinded, suffocated, and terrified, but it also defined the look, feel, and even mythology of the city. To walk through a pea super was to experience London at its most raw, a city wrapped in its own smoky shroud. So while we may imagine Victorian fog as romantic, the truth was far murkier, literally. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but you could smell the guy next to you. And if you made it home without falling in a ditch, choking on soot, or losing your wallet, you counted it as a good day. The smell of cleanliness was also not that clean. When we picture laundry today, we think of lemon-scented detergents, humming machines, and neatly folded piles of fresh clothes. In Victorian London, doing the wash was closer to a street performance involving steam, sweat, and smells that refused to leave. Laundry was not simply a household chore, it was an industry, sprawling across neighbourhoods, filling alleys with vats of boiling water, and perfuming the air with a cocktail of soap suds and something vaguely rotten. For most families, especially in the working classes, washing clothes at home was nearly impossible. Few houses had the space, water, or equipment for it. Instead, they relied on laundresses or public washhouses. Laundresses were the unsung backbone of cleanliness in Victorian London. Women who spent long days bent over steaming tubs, scrubbing collars, cuffs, and sheets until their arms ached. But their workplaces, often sheds, yards, or cramped rooms, were far from fragrant. The process was grueling. First, clothes had to be boiled in large copper vats of water, often mixed with soap shavings or soda. This boiling stage alone filled entire streets with the smell of hot soapy steam, which might sound pleasant until you realize it was mixed with the odor of sweat-soaked linens, greasy work shirts, and undergarments that had been worn far too long. Victorian soap itself, made from animal fats, wasn't exactly perfumed lavender. It smelled faintly of the slaughterhouse it came from. The result? Clean laundry carried with it a lingering tang of boiled fat and caustic soda. After boiling came scrubbing. Clothes were rubbed vigorously against washboards or beaten with sticks to dislodge dirt. Water sloshed across floors and down gutters, turning alleys into miniature rivers of greyish suds. These streams weren't as pure as they looked. They carried residues of dirt, grease, and sometimes body lice floating merrily toward the drains. Children splashed in them, dogs lapped them up, and the smell settled into the pavement like a permanent reminder that cleanliness had to fight its own battle against stink. Then came drying. In the absence of tumble dryers, clotheslines stretched across courtyards, alleys, and even above streets. In working-class neighbourhoods, it wasn't unusual to see laundry flapping between tenements like banners of survival. But here's the catch. While the sheets dried, they absorbed the city's air, coal smoke, manure, fish markets, and the general perfume of Victorian life. The result was freshly washed laundry that smelled suspiciously like the street it hung above. Cleanliness was relative. Public washhouses offered another option, especially for those without space at home. These washhouses, or laundry institutes, were established in the mid-19th century as part of public health reforms. For a small fee, women could use communal boilers, sinks, and drying rooms. The idea was noble: provide affordable cleanliness to the poor. In reality, The atmosphere inside was like stepping into a cloud of steam mixed with the scents of hundreds of strangers' dirty clothes. Imagine a Turkish bath, but instead of eucalyptus oils, the air smelled of old socks and lye. The work took its toll on laundresses. Constant exposure to hot water and harsh chemicals left hands raw, red and cracked. Steam filled their lungs, leaving many with chronic coughs. Hours of hauling heavy, wet clothes wrecked backs and shoulders. Yet despite the toil, laundresses earned little, often barely enough to survive. To add insult to injury, their work was considered menial, a step above scullery maids but still low in social standing. Ironically, the women who provided the city with cleanliness often lived in some of its dirtiest, poorest corners. Laundry also had a reputation for scandal. Laundresses were sometimes stereotyped as gossipers or flirtatious, in part because they moved through households and neighborhoods, hearing and seeing everything. Popular culture painted them as comic figures with loud voices and stronger arms, forever ringing, beating and scolding. But behind the stereotype was the reality of grueling, underpaid labor in an environment that never smelled quite as clean as it promised. For neighbors, laundry days were unavoidable. Streets filled with steam as if a small fog had rolled in, carrying with it the scent of boiling soap and damp cloth. Gutters ran with sudsy water staining the cobblestones. Passing pedestrians sometimes caught the spray of a laundress wringing out a particularly heavy sheet, leaving them spattered in what could generously be called Victorian Febreze. Complaints were common, but so was resignation. After all, laundry was necessary, and if it stank, it was at least the stink of attempted cleanliness. Even the wealthy weren't immune to laundry's less than pleasant side. Though they employed servants to handle their washing, the sheer volume of linens in upper-class households meant that laundry rooms resembled small factories. Giant boilers roared, maids scurried back and forth with baskets of damp sheets, and the smell of wet cloth hung perpetually in the air. Guests may have admired the crisp tablecloths and gleaming bed linens, but they rarely thought about the army of women laboring in clouds of soapy steam to produce them. By the end of the 19th century, technological improvements like washing machines and better detergents began to ease the burden, at least for wealthier households. But for most of the Victorian period, laundry remained a sensory ordeal. Clean clothes weren't fresh, they were just less dirty and infused with the lingering aroma of boiling fat soap, damp cloth and coal smoke. So while Victorians might have prided themselves on appearances, polished shoes, tidy collars, pressed dresses, the reality was less fragrant. The pursuit of cleanliness filled entire streets with the smells of hot suds and dirty runoff. The laundry might sparkle, but the neighborhood certainly didn't. Relief stations relieved you but tortured your nose. For much of Victorian London, answering the call of nature was a public affair, not because people enjoyed the spotlight, but because there simply weren't enough private facilities to go around. With millions crowding into the city, the question of where to go became a civic crisis. Chamber pots and cesspits handled home life, but once you stepped outside, the problem was harder to ignore. Thus began the slow, smelly rise of the public toilet. At first, public convenience was an optimistic phrase. Early Victorian London offered precious few places for relief, especially for women. Men had a slight advantage. Crude public urinals appeared in the form of iron screens or open stalls on street corners. These structures were sometimes nothing more than a wall to shield passers-by from the view of men doing their business. Privacy was minimal, hygiene non-existent, and the smell unmistakable. Walk past one on a hot summer day, and you'd know instantly what purpose it served. Women had it worse. Few facilities catered to them at all. Victorian morality balked at the idea of women relieving themselves outside the home, as if their bladders were bound by stricter codes of modesty. Shopping trips, market visits, or long walks were limited not just by time or distance, but by the uncomfortable reality that there was nowhere respectable to go. Some desperate women resorted to chamber pots in lodging houses, or tucked discreetly under skirts in side alleys. It wasn't until later in the century that women's public conveniences began to appear, and even then they were scarce, hidden, and often cost a penny to use. By the mid-1800s, however, reformers began pushing for proper facilities. The Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace offered a glimpse of the future. For the first time, visitors could use public toilets with flushing mechanisms, paying a penny for the privilege. The novelty was so popular that the phrase "to spend a penny" entered the English language as a polite euphemism. These exhibition toilets were clean, efficient, and shockingly modern, but they were the exception, not the rule. Back in the city streets, most public conveniences were far less glamorous. Underground lavatories, introduced in the 1850s and 60s, were an improvement but came with their own challenges. Descend a set of stone steps, and you'd find tiled chambers fitted with stalls, urinals, and attendants. They were a marvel of civic planning, until you realized how quickly thousands of daily visitors could overwhelm them. Ventilation was poor, cleaning was sporadic, and the smell drifted back up into the streets like an invisible advertisement. Relief stations relieved you, but tortured your nose. The upkeep of these facilities depended on attendants, often elderly men or women who doled out toilet paper or newspaper cuttings for the less fortunate and collected pennies. Their job required nerves of steel and a tolerance for odors that would have felled a lesser mortal. Some attendants became familiar figures in their neighborhoods, known as much for their scowls as for their buckets of disinfectant. But despite their efforts, Victorian disinfectants, lime, carbolic acid, or just buckets of water, could only mask so much. The battle between smell and sanitation was ongoing, and smell usually won. Public urinals in particular became notorious. Some were open-air pissoirs, iron structures with decorative screens designed to offer men discretion while keeping the city tidy. Unfortunately, discretion didn't extend to the nose. These urinals quickly became hubs of odor, their drains struggling to cope with constant use. Rain only spread the problem further, creating puddles that pedestrians stepped around with grimaces. Complaints poured into local councils, but the facilities remained, because the alternative was worse. Men relieving themselves against walls, alleys, or even shop fronts. Class differences showed themselves here too. Wealthier Londoners had options. Private clubs, hotels, or lavish department stores like Harrods eventually offered restrooms for their patrons. The poor, meanwhile, relied on public conveniences that were anything but convenient. For them, a penny fee was a meaningful cost, and many simply opted for the nearest alley or quiet corner. This widened the gap between respectable and rough neighborhoods, as the smell of urine became another marker of poverty. Women's facilities, when they finally arrived, reflected Victorian anxieties. They were tucked discreetly underground or hidden behind elaborate architecture, as though society feared acknowledging that women too needed toilets. Access often required a penny, reinforcing the idea that comfort was a luxury rather than a right. Women's advocacy groups argued for more facilities, but progress was slow. For many, city outings remained a careful calculation of distance, time, and bladder capacity. Public toilets also became unexpected social spaces. Men loitered around urinals to chat, while underground lavatories sometimes served as discreet meeting places. In time, they even developed reputations in certain districts as sites of illicit activity, from petty crime to clandestine romances. What was intended as purely functional infrastructure took on layers of social meaning and smells, always smells. Despite their flaws, public conveniences were a step toward modern sanitation. They acknowledged that relieving oneself wasn't just a private issue but a public health necessity. Without them, the streets would have been even filthier than they already were. By the end of the century, London boasted dozens of underground lavatories, some even ornately decorated with ironwork, tiles, and etched glass. They were, in their way, proud symbols of progress, though no amount of brass fittings could disguise the underlying odor. For Victorians, the public toilet was both a marvel and a menace. It solved an undeniable problem while creating new ones. Relief was possible, but dignity was questionable, and the smell was unavoidable. So while London may have lit the world with its empire and industry, it also forced its citizens to face one universal truth. No matter how grand your city, Everyone still needs to spend a penny. Think of it as eau de suite with floral highlights. Victorian London was a city where people rarely bathed, laundries struggled, and streets themselves reeked. Naturally, the human body joined the chorus. Body odor was not an occasional embarrassment, it was a constant companion. Men and women alike sweated through layers of heavy clothing, walked crowded streets filled with heat and smoke, and often went weeks without a proper wash. If you think a packed subway train today can be overwhelming, multiply that by coal smoke, woolen undergarments, and a total absence of deodorant. Daily hygiene was minimal. A splash of water on the face, a dab on the hands, and maybe a wipe of the feet was considered sufficient for many. But armpits, torsos, and other less public regions rarely saw soap and water. The natural consequence was an urban population wrapped in its own musk, from the clerk in his waistcoat to the lady in her hoop skirt. And because Victorians wore layers, chemises, corsets, shirts, cravats, petticoats, jackets, shawls, sweat was trapped like a prisoner, slowly marinating the fabric until the odor was part of the outfit itself. Enter perfume. If you couldn't get rid of the smell, you covered it. Victorian perfumery flourished, offering an arsenal of scents designed to mask sweat and grime. Cologne was splashed liberally on handkerchiefs, gloves, and skin. Ladies carried vinaigrettes, small silver containers filled with vinegar-soaked sponges or aromatic herbs, which they held to their noses in foul-smelling environments. Men dabbed cologne on their mustaches so that every breath carried a note of citrus or spice instead of the reality lurking beneath. Perfumes of the era were strong, often made with heavy floral or musky notes. Rose, lavender, jasmine, and patchouli were favorites. The wealthy might afford exotic imports like sandalwood or ambergris, while the poor bought cheaper versions diluted with alcohol or mixed with oils of questionable quality. The result was less delicate scent and more cloud of flowers wrestling with body odor. It was an olfactory duel fought daily, with sweat usually winning by mid-afternoon. Powders also played a key role. Both men and women dusted themselves with scented talc or starch-based powders, patting them onto skin or hair to absorb grease. Ladies might sprinkle perfumed powder into their wigs or bonnets. Gentlemen sometimes brushed powder inside their collars and underarms, hoping to stay fresh a little longer. In practice, these powders mixed with sweat to form a paste that clung stubbornly to fabric and skin. Instead of removing odors, it created new ones. Imagine violets mixed with yesterday's perspiration and a dash of coal dust. Clothing itself was treated with scents. Scented sachets were tucked into drawers and wardrobes to keep garments smelling fresh. Gloves were perfumed before sale, and handkerchiefs were deliberately scented so that one could sniff them while passing through a particularly foul street. Perfumed gloves became a fashion statement and a defense mechanism. A lady might politely dab her nose with a glove, but in reality, she was trying to survive the scent of a fishmonger's stall or the gentleman next to her who had skipped his monthly bath. Not all attempts were successful. Some colognes and perfumes were so strong that they caused headaches or nausea, especially in cramped theatres or ballrooms where dozens of people wore competing scents. Imagine attending a soiree where lavender, musk, and patchouli clashed violently with sweat, wine, and stale food. Dances became a heady whirl, not just of music, but of mingling smells. Romantic waltzes were less scent of roses and more sweaty rose wrestling with smoked herring. Class differences loomed large here. Wealthier Victorians could afford high-quality perfumes, powders, and clean linens, creating an aura of refinement even when bathing was rare. The poor, however, relied on cheaper concoctions or none at all. Their scent was often described by middle-class observers in moral terms, as if body odor signified laziness or sin. The irony, of course, was that many reformers preaching cleanliness were themselves masking their natural smells with expensive perfume, rather than actually washing. Body odor also became a subject of satire. Punch magazine published jokes about the bouquet of the omnibus, referring to the mix of perfumes and perspiration one encountered on crowded public transport. Satirists mocked dandies who drowned themselves in cologne to disguise their lack of soap. Even Charles Dickens poked fun at the hypocrisy of genteel society. Elegant characters who reeked of perfume but lived in houses filled with unwashed bodies. There was also a medical angle. Some Victorians believed strong scents had protective powers. Since miasma theory held that bad smells spread disease, perfumes and colognes were thought to purify the air. Carrying a scented handkerchief wasn't just fashion, it was health insurance. Doctors even prescribed certain scents, suggesting lavender or vinegar could ward off illness. Of course, in reality they only made the air smell differently terrible, not safer. Despite these efforts, body odor never truly disappeared. It remained the background note of Victorian life, mingling with smoke, manure and sewage to create the city's signature aroma. Perfume didn't erase it. It simply layered over it like painting roses on a rubbish heap. For Londoners, this was normal. A gentleman smelling faintly of patchouli and perspiration, or a lady trailing jasmine mixed with damp corset, was just the scent of civilization in progress. So while modern deodorant ads promise freshness and confidence, Victorian London offered something else: the daily struggle between body and bottle. Think of it as eau de suite with floral highlights, a fragrance nobody wanted but everybody wore. London was never short of roommates, you just didn't invite them. The city may have been the capital of an empire, but under the skirts of its grandeur lurked an army of tiny conquerors: rats, lice and fleas. While the Victorians wrestled with sewage, smoke and spoiled food, these creatures thrived in the shadows, gnawing, crawling and biting their way through every level of society. They didn't just make life itchy and unpleasant, they spread disease and misery with a persistence that made them as much a part of London as the Thames itself. Rats were the most visible invaders. Wherever humans went, rats followed, drawn to overflowing garbage heaps, butcher scraps and grain stores. Victorian London, with its open drains and endless food waste, was a rodent paradise. They swarmed through cellars, kitchens and warehouses, bold enough to scurry across tavern floors even while customers were drinking. In poorer neighborhoods, it wasn't unusual for families to hear the scrabbling of claws in the walls at night, or to find rats helping themselves to bread right off the table. Some households set traps or kept cats, but for every rat caught, 10 more seemed to appear. The sheer scale of the problem was astonishing. Contemporary observers described whole streets alive with rats after dark. At docks along the Thames, mountains of grain and imported food drew rodents in such numbers that dock workers sometimes gave up fighting them and learned to coexist. Rats also had a nasty habit of gnawing through wooden beams, food barrels, and even clothing. Imagine pulling on a pair of trousers only to discover that someone with whiskers had already taken a bite out of them. And of course, rats weren't just nuisances, they were potential disease carriers. Though the Victorians didn't yet fully understand germ theory, they associated rodents with illness, and for good reason. Rats spread fleas, and fleas spread plague, typhus and other nasties. Outbreaks of disease in crowded districts often followed infestations. For families already weakened by hunger and poverty, a few flea bites could turn into weeks of fever and misery. Rats weren't alone. Fleas and lice were constant companions for Londoners, rich and poor alike. With bathing infrequent and laundry irregular, human bodies became 5-star resorts for parasites. Lice nested in seams of clothing, thriving in the warmth of wool and linen. Children in schools scratched their scalps raw, while adults quietly endured the crawling sensations under layers of fabric. A louse didn't care whether it was biting a costermonger in Whitechapel or a gentleman in Mayfair. Everyone was fair game. Fleas, meanwhile, were the great equalizers of discomfort. They infested bedding, rugs and upholstery, waiting for warm bodies to feed on. Bedrooms were rarely free from their leaps, and travellers often returned from inns covered in tiny red bites. Writers of the era joked that Londoners had become so used to fleas that they treated them like old acquaintances. One wit remarked that fleas were the only creatures in London who never went hungry. Bedbugs added to the misery, lurking in mattresses and feasting on sleepers at night. Their bites left itchy welts, and their presence was nearly impossible to eradicate without burning the bedding. Many families simply endured, scratching through their mornings and shrugging off the discomfort. Bedbugs were so common that jokes about them entered popular slang, a grim kind of humor about the inevitability of sharing your bed with strangers. Animals carried their share of vermin too. Horses, cats and dogs all hosted fleas and ticks, which happily transferred to human hosts. Rats, as ever, spread their flea armies wherever they went. In crowded tenements, the combined effect was staggering. People, pets and pests living side by side in a wriggling, biting ecosystem. Authorities tried to address the problem, though with limited success. Rat catchers roamed the streets with dogs and ferrets, advertising their services to households plagued by infestations. Some became minor celebrities, demonstrating their skills in public displays where terriers dispatched dozens of rats in minutes. But these efforts were like bailing water with a sieve. Rats bred faster than they could be killed. As for lice and fleas, remedies ranged from combs and vinegar washes to powders containing toxic chemicals. None were particularly effective, and most people learned to live with the constant itch. The psychological toll was heavy. Imagine scratching through a church service, or trying to court someone while pretending not to notice lice crawling along your collar. Children grew up accepting that insects were part of life, while adults adopted a stoic attitude. In an age when survival was already precarious, vermin were just one more misery to endure. Culturally, vermin became symbols of urban decay. Rats scurrying through alleys and fleas biting through petticoats were used in reformist tracts to highlight the filth of working-class districts. But satire also found a place. Cartoonists drew rats in waistcoats mocking politicians, or fleas exaggerated into metaphors for nosy landlords and tax collectors. Even as they spread disease, vermin became part of London's cultural imagination, reminders that no empire was too grand to avoid a good scratching. By the late Victorian period, as sanitation improved and sewers expanded, vermin populations shifted but never disappeared. Rats still thrived near docks, fleas and lice still haunted beds and collars, and reformers still despaired. It wasn't until the 20th century, with better pest control and more regular bathing, that Londoners truly began to evict their uninvited roommates. But in the 19th century, vermin were as much a part of daily life as coal smoke or crowded streets. London may have built railways, factories and palaces, but it also built a thriving ecosystem of parasites. Everyone in the city had roommates. They just happened to be small, furry, or six-legged. Even the dead refused to rest quietly. Victorian London's problems didn't end with the living. The dead, it turned out, were also contributing to the city's great olfactory crisis. By the early 19th century, London's population had exploded, and so had its cemeteries. Overcrowding became so extreme that graveyards leaked more than grief. They leaked smells, seepage, and sometimes disturbingly their contents. London had hundreds of parish churchyards, many of them centuries old and hemmed in by buildings. As the population grew, burials increased, but the space didn't. Coffins were stacked on top of each other, sometimes 6 or 7 deep, until graves resembled layered cakes of wood, bone and soil. When no space remained, gravediggers simply dug shallow plots, disturbing older remains to make room for new ones. This meant that bones and partially decomposed bodies occasionally surfaced, staring grimly at neighbors who had paid for eternal rest. The smell was unforgettable. Decomposing flesh gives off gases that rise through the soil, especially in warm weather. In packed graveyards, those gases had nowhere to go but up. Locals complained of graveyard effluvia drifting through nearby houses, clinging to curtains and ruining appetites. One horrified resident described it as the breath of the dead visiting the living. Windows overlooking graveyards were often kept firmly shut, no matter the heat. In some cases, the problem was literal leakage. Coffins rotted, vaults cracked, and the fluids of decomposition seeped into surrounding soil. In particularly unfortunate neighborhoods, groundwater became tainted. There were reports of wells near cemeteries producing water with a peculiar taste, which is a polite Victorian way of saying it tasted like corpses. Families drinking from such wells often fell ill, and though germ theory was still young, People suspected that drinking dead neighbors wasn't ideal for health. Churchyards also became infamous for their appearances. With constant burials and little upkeep, they turned into muddy, uneven spaces cluttered with leaning headstones and half-exposed coffins. Dogs scavenged bones, rats burrowed freely, and children sometimes played among the graves. Imagine a grim playground where hopscotch squares are drawn between tombstones and your ball rolls into a half-open coffin. For many Londoners, this was daily reality. The stench was so bad that reformers began campaigning for change. One infamous case was in 1842, when Edwin Chadwick, a social reformer, wrote a damning report on urban graveyards. He described how the atmosphere of the houses and streets surrounding the churchyards is tainted by emanations from the decomposing bodies. In plain English, the dead were making the living sick. Chadwick's report shocked readers by pointing out that diseases could spread not just through sewage but through the very air wafting off graveyards. The problem was particularly dire in poorer districts. Wealthy families could afford vaults or burial plots in newer cemeteries on the city's outskirts, where space was abundant. The poor, however, were crammed into old parish yards, sometimes buried 3 or 4 to a coffin, with quicklime tossed in to speed decomposition. In such conditions, dignity evaporated along with the smell. Funerals were conducted with solemnity, but within weeks the grave itself might be disturbed for the next body. Eventually, the crisis became impossible to ignore. Outbreaks of cholera in the 1830s and 40s fueled fears that graveyard miasma was poisoning entire neighborhoods. Whether or not the smell itself spread disease, it didn't, though contaminated water did. The association was powerful enough to spark reform. In 1852, Parliament passed the Burial Act, closing many inner-city graveyards and encouraging the creation of new cemeteries outside London. These magnificent 7 cemeteries, including Highgate, Kensal Green and Brompton, offered vast landscaped grounds where burials could proceed in peace, free from the horrors of overcrowded parish yards. They were marketed not only as sanitary, but as beautiful, places where Victorians could visit loved ones and stroll among elegant monuments. Highgate in particular became famous for its dramatic tombs, leafy avenues, and of course the chance to spot Karl Marx once he arrived there permanently. Yet even as new cemeteries solved the health problem, the reputation of graveyard stench lingered. Writers and satirists continued to reference it as a symbol of the city's inability to manage its dead. Jokes circulated about the chattiness of the deceased, who refused to stay buried. Horror stories spread of coffins bursting under pressure, releasing noxious gases that felled gravediggers. It was both grotesque and absurd. Even in death, Londoners couldn't catch a break from the smells. For ordinary people, living near a graveyard was a trial. Rent was often cheaper next to churchyards, precisely because of the odor. Poor families put up with it, learning to ignore the wafts of decay drifting in through their windows. Children growing up in such neighborhoods became desensitized. For them, graveyard air was just another smell in the mix of fish markets, smoke and manure. Only visitors found it unbearable, clutching handkerchiefs to their noses as locals shrugged. The Victorians had a complicated relationship with death, surrounding it with rituals, mourning clothes, and elaborate funerals. Yet all this solemnity contrasted starkly with the reality of graveyards leaking stink into city life. Death was supposed to be dignified, but in overcrowded London, it was anything but. So when reform finally moved burials out of the city, it wasn't just about sanitation, it was about reclaiming dignity for the dead and peace for the living. After all, in a city already plagued by smoke, sewage, and spoiled food, nobody wanted their neighbors alive or otherwise, adding to the bouquet. The poor smelled of survival, the rich of scented denial. Victorian London was a city of stark contrasts. On one side of town, dukes and duchesses strolled boulevards lit by gas lamps, dabbing perfume on their gloves. On the other, entire families crammed into single damp rooms, surrounded by odors that reminded them survival was a full-time occupation. And while wealth divided these neighborhoods, so too did the smells. The city's class system had an unmistakable fragrance or stench, In the East End slums, smell was part of the rent. Narrow streets were lined with dilapidated houses where dozens of people shared the same cramped quarters. With little to no plumbing, residents relied on chamber pots and backyard privies that overflowed regularly. Waste often ended up in the street or nearby ditches, mingling with rainwater and horse manure. The result was an ever-present background stench of human and animal filth, laced with the sour tang of damp walls and mildew. Add to this the smells of livelihood. Many slum dwellers worked from home in trades like tanning scraps, tailoring or matchmaking, the phosphorus-laden kind, not romance. These industries brought their own stenches, glue pots, chemicals, and dyes permeated living spaces. Families slept in the same rooms where fat was boiled, cloth was dyed, or shoes were repaired. The line between workshop and home dissolved, leaving an odor of labor etched into every wall and garment. Food added another layer. The poor often ate what was cheapest: offal, spoiled vegetables, or yesterday's fish. Cooking smells lingered long after meals, mixing with the smoky haze of cheap coal fires. A single frying pan might serve dozens of meals without ever truly being cleaned, so kitchens smelled perpetually of half-burnt fat. Street vendors added their own contribution: the pungent reek of fried eels, hot pies of questionable filling, or whelk stalls. For slum neighborhoods, the bouquet was survival itself: pungent, greasy, unignorable. Now shift westward. In neighborhoods like Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington, the air was ostensibly fresher. Streets were broader, lined with trees and grand townhouses. Refuse was collected more regularly, and wealthy households had servants to keep chamber pots discreetly emptied. Here the smells were less about sewage and more about artifice. Perfumes, scented soaps, and fresh-cut flowers wafted from parlors. Kitchens prepared roasts, pastries, and imported delicacies. The aromas contained neatly behind servant doors. On the surface, the West End smelled of refinement, but scratch that polished surface and the truth seeped through. Wealthy neighborhoods still relied on coal, filling drawing rooms with the faint scent of smoke. Even the most gilded ballrooms couldn't entirely escape the smog rolling across the city. Moreover, many of the perfumes and soaps used to mask odors were themselves strong, overpowering floral or musky scents that sometimes replaced one assault on the senses with another. The rich weren't odorless, they just smelled more expensive. The contrast was starkest when the two worlds collided. Servants carried the smells of slum neighborhoods into the homes of their employers. A maid who lived in a damp tenement might bring with her the faint odor of mold or unwashed laundry. The wealthy tolerated it, barely, while demanding she scrub their linens until they gleamed. Similarly, working-class street vendors sold food or wares in wealthy districts, trailing the aromas of their trades behind them. For the rich, it was a reminder that the poor and their smells were inescapable. Smell even became a marker of morality. Middle-class reformers often described the slums as places of stench and vice, as if foul air itself encouraged immorality. They saw perfume and fresh air as symbols of virtue, while poverty's odors were cast as evidence of laziness or sin. This moral sniff test ignored the obvious truth: it's hard to smell like roses when you're living 10 to a room with a broken privy. Writers of the time often highlighted the divide. Charles Dickens painted vivid contrasts between the filth of East End courts and the opulence of West End salons. Journalists covering poverty tours reported being nearly overwhelmed by the smells of slum alleys, returning westward to write about the relief of fresh air, though it was usually just air laced with expensive cologne and coal smoke. The juxtaposition itself became a cultural fascination. How could one city contain both the perfume counter at Harrods and the reek of a Whitechapel alley within a few miles of each other? The smells of poverty and wealth also played out in social rituals. The poor might douse themselves in cheap cologne for Sunday church, trying to mask a week's worth of sweat and soot. The wealthy, meanwhile, flooded themselves in costly perfumes before attending balls, convinced it elevated them above the rabble. In practice, both groups were fighting the same battle against human odor, one with lavender water from a street stall, the other with rose attar from Paris. The difference was not the struggle, but the price tag. By the late Victorian period, sanitation reforms began narrowing the gap. Sewers reduced some of the worst stenches in working-class districts, while wealthier households gained access to modern plumbing. Yet the contrast persisted. To walk from East End to West End was to travel not only through class lines but through entire olfactory worlds, from the acrid stew of poverty to the cloying sweetness of luxury. So while the poor smelled of survival, sweat, soot, spoiled food, the rich smelled of denial, layering perfume over the same human realities. London, in the end, was a city united by its smells, even as it was divided by class. The only difference was whether you paid a penny for violets or simply hoped your neighbour's chamber pot didn't tip toward your doorstep. Drink the water, spin the disease wheel. Cholera was the jackpot nobody wanted. For Victorians, water was both essential and dangerous. The Thames might have been the river of empire, but it was also the city's largest sewer. Londoners drank from it, washed in it, and dumped waste into it. If that sounds like a terrible idea, that's because it was, but at the time many didn't realize just how deadly it could be. The result was a century of outbreaks where thousands perished, their lives claimed by an invisible killer, cholera. Water contamination was practically guaranteed in Victorian London. Sewers, where they existed, drained directly into the Thames. In areas without proper drainage, cesspits leaked into wells and pumps. Rain carried refuse from streets straight into rivers and ditches. Breweries, slaughterhouses, and tanneries poured waste into the same waterways used for drinking. By mid-century, anyone dipping a bucket into the Thames was scooping up a cocktail of human waste, industrial byproducts, and decaying animal matter, and yet people still did it. The mystery of why cholera spread baffled doctors for decades. The dominant theory was miasma, the idea that bad air caused disease. Reformers insisted the stench of open drains and cesspits was directly responsible. In truth, they weren't entirely wrong. Smells were a symptom of contamination, but the true culprit was microscopic. Cholera bacteria lurked in polluted water, invisible to the naked eye but devastating once ingested. Unfortunately, germ theory was still in its infancy, and until it gained traction, the city fought the wrong enemy. Outbreaks struck repeatedly. The first major epidemic hit London in 1832, followed by further waves in 1848, 1854, and 1866. Each time, the death toll climbed into the thousands. Victims suffered sudden violent symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration so severe the body shriveled within hours. Skin turned blue, eyes sank, and life drained away with terrifying speed. Families watched in horror as loved ones perished in less than a day. For many, cholera felt like divine punishment delivered by water itself. The social impact was immense. In poor neighborhoods, where people relied on communal pumps and wells, cholera spread like wildfire. Whole families were wiped out. Slums became synonymous with death, and the disease's reputation only deepened existing prejudices. Reformers blamed the poor for living in filth, while the poor pointed out that they had no choice. But cholera did not respect class boundaries. Even in wealthier districts, contaminated water supplies meant the disease could strike without warning. Fear stalked every household, regardless of status. The 1854 outbreak in Soho became the turning point. In the midst of panic, a physician named John Snow made a revolutionary observation. He noticed that cases clustered around one water pump on Broad Street. By mapping infections, he demonstrated that the pump's water, contaminated by a leaking cesspit, was the source of the epidemic. His famous removal of the pump handle is often credited with proving that cholera spread through water, not air. At the time, many dismissed his findings, but his work laid the foundation for modern epidemiology. Cholera outbreaks also spurred civic action. The Great Stink of 1858 finally convinced Parliament to act, and Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system began diverting waste away from the Thames. These massive engineering works didn't just clear the air, they saved lives by reducing waterborne contamination. By the 1870s, outbreaks of cholera declined significantly, replaced by new understandings of sanitation and public health. But for much of the century, Londoners lived with the gamble. Drinking water meant risking disease. Some tried to protect themselves by boiling it, drinking beer or gin instead, or collecting rainwater. The middle classes turned to bottled mineral water, believing its clarity equaled purity. Unfortunately, many couldn't afford alternatives, and so they drank from pumps that might just as easily deliver life as death. The fear of cholera shaped Victorian attitudes towards smell itself. Because bad odors were associated with disease, reformers demanded cleaner streets, improved drainage, and stricter rules on refuse. Ironically, while miasma theory was wrong, it motivated the very reforms that helped control cholera. The link between stink and sickness may have been misunderstood, but it spurred the city to finally clean itself up. The psychological toll of cholera was heavy. Imagine living in a city where the very act of quenching your thirst felt like a gamble with fate. Parents hesitated before giving their children water. Rumors spread of cursed pumps or poisoned wells. Entire neighborhoods lived under the dread that a sip today could mean a coffin tomorrow. By the late Victorian period, the combination of Bazalgette sewers, cleaner water supplies, and the slow acceptance of germ theory brought relief. Cholera receded, but its memory lingered. It became a cautionary tale of what happens when a city grows too fast, ignores sanitation, and underestimates the power of invisible enemies. So when Victorians joked grimly about taking the waters, they weren't talking about spa towns. In London, drinking the water was like spinning a wheel of fortune, where cholera was the jackpot nobody wanted, and everyone had a ticket. They didn't clean the city, they just moved the smell somewhere else. Victorian London prided itself on being the capital of a world empire, but for much of the century, its streets looked more like the world's dumping ground. Refuse of every description, animal dung, household garbage, rotting vegetables, broken crockery, dead cats, and the occasional dead drunk, littered thoroughfares. To keep the city from drowning in its own debris, an army of cleaners and dustmen patrolled the streets. Their mission, tidy up London. Their reality, shuffle the filth around and hope no one noticed too much. The term dustman sounds almost whimsical, but their work was anything but. These were the men who collected household refuse, known as dust, because it was mostly ash from coal fires. Every London household burned coal, leaving behind heaps of cinders. Far from useless, these ashes could be sold to brickmakers and farmers as raw material, so dustmen carted it off in great piles. But ashes were only part of the story. Mixed in were scraps of food, bones, broken pots, and the occasional mystery object no one wanted to claim. Dust heaps became iconic. Towering mounds of waste where children scavenged for treasures and pigs rooted for edibles. Street sweeping was another attempt at order. Teams of sweepers, often poor men or women with little more than brooms and shovels, scraped muck from cobblestones into heaps. The muck, a polite Victorian term covering everything from manure to vomit, was then shoveled into carts and hauled away. At least in theory. In practice, sweepers often left piles behind, especially in back alleys. Rain turned them into foul puddles, while sun baked them into crusts that glued themselves to boots. Horses provided the biggest challenge. With tens of thousands clopping through the city daily, manure was inescapable. Dustmen tried to keep up, but for every cartload removed, fresh droppings appeared. Satirists joked that London's true currency wasn't gold or silver, but horse dung. Sweepers worked from dawn to dusk, yet pedestrians still found themselves dodging piles on every street. For women in long skirts, the situation was particularly dire. One misstep, and a gown became a sponge for manure. The smell of collection was almost as bad as the smell of neglect. Dust carts lumbered through neighborhoods, creaking under the weight of waste. In summer heat, they stank so strongly that residents shut their windows to keep the odor out, only to sweat miserably inside. Dustmen themselves were easy to identify, their clothes stiff with grime, their hands blackened, and their very bodies carrying the perfume of London's garbage. They were essential workers, but nobody wanted to sit too close to one on the omnibus. Waste didn't always stay gone. Much of it was hauled to dumps on the city's outskirts where it festered in open-air heaps. These dumps grew into mountains of refuse looming over nearby communities. Scavengers, both human and animal, picked through them constantly. Dogs, rats, and even goats feasted on the remains, while the poor salvaged wood, metal, or scraps of cloth. The smell drifted for miles, making nearby housing cheap, though cheap often meant unlivable. Still, there was a peculiar kind of recycling at work. Dustmen sold ashes to brickmakers, bones to glue factories, and rags to paper mills. Even grease scraped from waste heaps might find its way into candle making. Nothing truly went to waste. It just went somewhere slightly less obvious. So while dustmen didn't exactly clean the city, they did redistribute its filth into the wider economy. You might be horrified to learn that the paper on which you wrote your letters once began life in a rag heap beside a dead rat. But such was Victorian efficiency. Street cleaning also became a matter of civic pride. In wealthy districts, residents demanded regular sweeping, and councils obliged. In poorer neighborhoods, cleaning was sporadic at best. The result was an olfactory class divide. Belgravia's roads gleamed relatively, while East End alleys festered. Visitors immediately noticed the contrast. A stroll west of Hyde Park offered streets merely tinged with smoke, while a detour east toward Whitechapel meant ankle-deep muck and the unmistakable bouquet of decay. Public complaints about filth were constant. Letters poured into newspapers, condemning the city for tolerating such squalor. Reformers argued that dirty streets weren't just unpleasant but actively dangerous, spreading disease through contact and smell. Municipal authorities experimented with solutions: better carts, organized routes, even mechanized sweepers later in the century. But progress was slow, and London's waste grew faster than the city could remove it. By the late 19th century, improvements in infrastructure finally began to make a difference. Bazalgette's sewer system reduced the overflow of human waste into the streets, and organized municipal services improved collection. Dust heaps gave way to more centralized disposal methods. But for most Victorians, the memory of trudging past stinking carts and dodging piles of manure remained etched into their senses. So while street cleaning was billed as progress, it often felt like an elaborate shuffle, moving smells from one place to another, sweeping filth into corners, and calling it improvement. For Londoners, the sight of a dustman with his cart was both a relief and a reminder. The city was never truly clean, only slightly rearranged. One man built pipes so future Londoners could breathe without gagging. By the mid-19th century, London's stench was no longer just a nuisance. It was a crisis. Overflowing cesspits, reeking markets, rotting waste, and above all the Thames's sewer had pushed the city to the edge. Cholera had killed tens of thousands. The Great Stink of 1858 had shut down Parliament. Something had to change, and that something arrived in the form of a stocky, mustachioed engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. Bazalgette wasn't a flashy man, but he was determined and meticulous, qualities London desperately needed. Appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, he was tasked with tackling the filth that threatened the capital's health and reputation. His solution was bold: build a vast network of underground sewers to intercept waste before it reached the Thames. It wasn't glamorous, but it was revolutionary. The scale of his project was staggering. Bazalgette designed nearly 1,300 miles of street sewers and more than 80 miles of main intercepting sewers, colossal brick-lined tunnels capable of carrying millions of gallons of waste. The system would collect sewage from across the city, funnel it eastward, and discharge it far downstream, away from central London. To power this feat, massive pumping stations were built, including the ornate Crossness pumping station, which managed to look like a cathedral to sanitation. Constructing these sewers required Herculean effort. Thousands of workers toiled underground, digging tunnels by hand, laying millions of bricks, and braving constant dangers from floods, cave-ins, and poisonous gases. Steam-driven machinery helped, but much of the work remained grueling manual labor. The sheer volume of materials used was breathtaking. Over 300 million bricks, 670,000 cubic yards of concrete, and countless iron fittings. Bazalgette's sewers weren't just pipes, they were engineering monuments buried beneath the city. And here's the genius part. Bazalgette overbuilt. He calculated the system's needed capacity based on London's population at the time, then doubled it. "We're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen," he reportedly said. His foresight saved the city. A century and a half later, much of London still relies on Bazalgette's Victorian sewers, which remain remarkably effective thanks to his oversized vision. Future Londoners, whether they knew his name or not, owed their fresher air to his stubborn calculations. The impact was immediate. Once the system began operating in the 1860s, the Thames cleared noticeably. The air along the river lost its nauseating stench. Outbreaks of cholera diminished. Though the link between germs and water wasn't fully acknowledged until later, ordinary Londoners began to notice their city was, at last, livable in a way it hadn't been for generations. Where once riverbanks were lined with foul sludge, people could now stroll without retching. But Bazalgette's work wasn't just about sewers, it reshaped the city itself. His embankments along the Thames, built to house sewer pipes, also created new roads and walkways. The Victoria Embankment, for example, became both a sanitary marvel and a fashionable promenade. London's infrastructure gained not only hidden tunnels, but also visible boulevards, marrying utility with civic pride. Sanitation and aesthetics went hand in hand, an unusual pairing for a city that had spent centuries treating sewage as an afterthought. Of course, the revolution wasn't without challenges. The project's cost was enormous, straining city budgets and sparking political fights. Critics grumbled at the expense, questioning whether it was worth it. Yet as cholera outbreaks waned and the smell of the Thames faded, even skeptics admitted that the investment had paid off. Few public works projects in history could claim to have saved as many lives, prevented as much disease, or improved a city's quality of life so dramatically. Bazalgette himself became something of a hero, though in the understated way engineers often do. He wasn't lionized like a general or statesman, but those who understood his contribution hailed him as the man who had rescued London from its own filth. His name lived on in plaques and engineering circles, while ordinary citizens simply enjoyed cleaner air and safer water without knowing whom to thank. The cultural shift was equally profound. Before Bazalgette, London had resigned itself to living with filth, assuming it was inevitable in a big city. After Bazalgette, cleanliness became a civic expectation. His sewers didn't just move waste, they changed how Londoners thought about public health and the responsibilities of government. Sanitation was no longer a private matter of chamber pots and cesspits. It was a public service, owed to every citizen. Today, when you walk along the Thames and admire its embankments, or when you flush a toilet without fearing the river will belch your business back at you, you're living in Bazalgette's legacy. He gave London more than sewers. He gave it dignity, health and air that no longer smelled like an open grave. So, while generals fought wars and politicians debated empires, Joseph Bazalgette fought the most important battle of all, the war on stink. And thanks to him, future Londoners could finally breathe without gagging. So next time you complain about traffic fumes, remember, you're not walking through a river of poop. Progress. Victorian London was not just a city of industry and empire, it was a city defined by its smells. The reek of open sewers, the haze of coal smoke, the tang of slaughterhouses, the perfumes of desperate Londoners masking their sweat. All these odors wove themselves into the fabric of daily life. For modern Londoners, it's almost impossible to imagine how much the city stank, but it's precisely that stench that forced the Victorians to confront the limits of urban growth and to invent the modern sanitation systems we now take for granted. The smells shaped perception. To live in London was to be constantly reminded of the consequences of population and progress. The poor lived surrounded by the odors of survival, rotting food, unwashed bodies, overflowing privies. The rich cloaked themselves in perfume and flowers, but even they could not entirely escape the smog or the drifting air of the Thames. Smell became a great social equalizer, a reminder that no matter how gilded your drawing room, the stink of the city could seep through. But stink was also a motivator. Reformers latched onto it, journalists described it, satirists mocked it, and doctors studied it. The Great Stink of 1858, when Parliament itself was nearly evacuated by the smell of the Thames, demonstrated that odor could bring even the mighty to their knees. Smell didn't respect rank or privilege, it drifted across class lines, invading noses indiscriminately, and in that way stench became a force for progress, driving London toward reforms that otherwise might have taken decades longer. Public health itself was reborn out of smell. Miasma theory may have been scientifically flawed, but its belief that foul odors carried disease inspired tangible improvements: cleaner streets, regulated burials, better waste collection, and most famously, Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system. By chasing away stink, Victorians inadvertently chased away disease. The nose led where the microscope eventually followed. The legacy also lives in infrastructure. London's embankments, sewer lines and water systems stand as monuments to a war fought not with weapons, but with bricks, pipes, and sheer stubbornness. Without the horrors of overflowing cesspits, mountains of manure, and cholera-tainted pumps, there might never have been the political will to invest in such massive projects. It's no exaggeration to say the city's future, and the health of millions, was bought with the price of enduring unbearable smells until action became unavoidable. Culturally, the stenches of Victorian London left a mark too. Writers used them to symbolize decay or moral corruption. Dickens painted vivid portraits of neighborhoods that practically reeked off the page. Satirists mocked dandies doused in perfume, and officials who ignored filth until it drifted through their office windows. Smell became shorthand for urban failure, but also for resilience. Londoners lived with the stink and built lives amid it, proving themselves as adaptable as the rats and fleas they cohabited with. The transformation was profound. By the end of the 19th century, London had gone from one of the dirtiest cities in the world to a model of sanitation reform. Sewers carried waste far from the city, public conveniences multiplied, street cleaning improved, and reformers championed fresh air and green spaces. Smell shifted from a constant assault to a manageable nuisance. Where once the city's identity had been inseparable from its reek, it now began to pride itself on modernity, cleanliness, and efficiency. And yet the legacy lingers in our expectations today. We assume tap water is safe. We expect garbage to be collected before it rots. We grumble about traffic fumes, but we don't expect them to come with the aroma of decomposing horses. Our sense of what a modern city should smell like was shaped directly by the horrors of Victorian London. If we complain when our recycling isn't collected for a week, we should remember that our great-great-grandparents endured centuries when refuse piled in the streets until pigs and rats picked it over. There's even a strange kind of gratitude buried in the memory of those stenches. Without the suffering they caused, without the great stink, without the cholera outbreaks, there might never have been the momentum for reform. The Victorians lived through smells that could make your stomach turn inside out, and in doing so they forced humanity to rethink what it meant to live together in a modern city. So the next time you wrinkle your nose at exhaust fumes or the dubious leftovers in your office fridge, spare a thought for the Londoner of 1850. They navigated streets of dung, dined beside spoiled fish, and drank water seasoned with sewage. Progress may not always smell like roses, but compared to Victorian London, it smells pretty sweet.